right, if everybody's ready, I just wanted to say before we begin how pleased we are to have Officer Peterson back. He was actually a member of our police department earlier, left us for the District of Columbia Police Department, and now he's back, and we're delighted to have him. So let me do the oath of office. I think you've done this once before, so you can probably do it from memory without me, right? All right, would you raise your right hand? I, and state your name,
I, Person Peterson,
do affirm under penalties of perjury
do affirm under penalties of perjury
that I will faithfully perform those duties
that I will faithfully perform those duties
assigned to me
assigned to me
as a police officer
as a police officer
for the city of Tacoma Park, Maryland,
for the city of Tacoma Park, Maryland,
that I will uphold the Constitution of the United States
that I will uphold the Constitution of the United States
and of the state of Maryland,
and of the state of Maryland,
that I will obey the commands of my superiors
that I will obey the commands of my superiors
and abide by all the rules,
and abide by all the rules,
policies, and procedures
policies, and procedures
of the police department,
of the police department,
that without prejudice or partiality,
that without prejudice or partiality,
I will perform my duties
I will perform my duties
and enforce all laws
and enforce all laws
within the city of Tacoma Park,
within the city of Tacoma Park,
and as I may otherwise
and as I may otherwise
have jurisdiction,
have jurisdiction,
and that I hereby acknowledge and accept
and that I hereby acknowledge and accept
this appointment
this appointment
as a public trust
as a public trust
requiring honesty and diligence.
requiring honesty and diligence.
Congratulations. We're delighted to have you. And I think the next thing we do is we go down here and we assume that the other council members will be arriving. Are there any council comments or announcements?
I have a whole slew of comments tonight. I guess I've been saving them up. Lots of activities happening in Ward 2. I went to a meeting this weekend about Long Branch, Sligo area traffic calming, and they're trying to do a comprehensive approach to coping with the cut-through traffic that speeds through their neighborhood. And that's going to be quite a challenge. There are folks in the area of Circle and Woodland who are interested in having lights on the path that goes between Woodland and, how do you pronounce that street? Goody? That are comparable to the ones that go between Goody and Poplar. I think those are solar-powered lights. There's some interest in stop signs in the Circle Avenue area, and they're still talking about that amongst themselves and trying to come to some kind of consensus. There's strong interest on a mural at the end of Conway that's visible from New Hampshire Avenue, and I've been talking with one of the community leaders there about that. This Thursday, there's going to be a change to our traffic calming test that we're doing at Lincoln Elm and Auburn, and we're going to change now from the test where we've been testing out the kind of narrowed intersection to testing out a traffic circle. So that change is going to happen on Thursday. So if you haven't had a chance to go through and check out the narrowed intersection, you've got a couple days left to do that before we move on to testing out the traffic circle. This Saturday, May 13th, from 10 to 2 at Forest Park is going to be a time to do some more work on the rain garden there that's at the base of Forest Park. I worked on that last fall, and it was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. So I invite anyone who's interested to come out and participate with the Friends of Sligo Creek and the city working on the rain garden. I had a great time at the New Hampshire Avenue tour earlier this week and learned a lot about all of the development opportunities that are available along New Hampshire Avenue, and I want to thank the staff for such the terrific job that they did putting that tour together and inviting the leaders from the surrounding jurisdictions. A reminder that there's an affordable housing forum for Tacoma Park coming up on May 23rd at 7 o'clock here in the council chambers. And then I had one question I wanted to ask. I see on the rolling agenda that I only see one other time that rent stabilization is coming up again, and I think we kind of didn't get to finish what we were talking about.
Right.
And the only time I see is next Monday, May 15th, discussion of proposed changes to the rental housing licensing program and discussion of proposed minor housekeeping revisions to the Tacoma Park Code, Chapter 6, housing. And I had a question about minor and when we were going to revisit this issue.
Right. That's not intended to be revisiting the issue. I am going to be sitting down with the staff tomorrow afternoon, as I always do on Tuesdays, to set out a schedule. We are consulting with the housing department and trying to figure out where we're going to stand vis-a-vis the budget before we lay out the next schedule for rent stabilization. We haven't forgotten it, and it's not on the agenda simply because we don't know when to put it on yet.
And the budget relationship to continuing the discussion of rent stabilization is?
We have allocated a great deal of time over the next several weeks for our budget discussions.
You mean just about budget discussions? Okay.
Right. And if that takes less time than we anticipate, then we'll have more time. If it takes more time than we've scheduled now, we will have to move other things.
It's really unlikely to take less time, so probably
That's
people can expect
that's
we'll
been
come
my
back to this
assumption.
in-
That's
in
been my
June and July.
assumption also. So I'm not squeezing in other things at this
Right.
point.
So people who are interested in that might expect it to come back again in June or July.
Before I say that, I want to consult with the staff and figure out if there's something else they need from us before they can go ahead and start, developing more specific proposals. If that's the case, if they need to hear from us again before they can start doing their own work, then I'll probably bring it back sooner.
Okay.
Okay? Bruce?
Yeah, I just wanted to let folks know that the developers who are intending to redevelop the 7001 Carroll Avenue site, that's the ICG Tacoma, have been continuing to meet with both the Historic Planning Commission and with the area neighborhoods, with WACO in particular, and they're continuing to refine their proposal. They've had their second, I don't remember exactly the correct title, but their second preliminary consultation with the Historic Preservation Commission. As far as I understand it, they're currently scheduled to go back to them for a third consultation, but that's not for some time yet. So that's continuing to evolve, and just wanted to let folks know that.
Yes, a couple of things. A constituent contacted me over the weekend about the Action Tacoma system and complained that it was out of action. And I don't know if anyone has had similar experiences with it, but we might give it a check and make sure it's operating as it is advertised. The other is in part based on the tour, which was very excellent on Friday afternoon, prompts a question to see if we could look into whatever might be necessary to change, I suppose, the city code to allow for city employees and others to be able to spot code violations. I understand now that it has to come from a neighbor or a citizen rather than initiated by a city employee. Is that accurate?
No, it really is not. I think the fact that we operate on more a complaint basis really has more to do, Councilmember Berry, with staffing. As you'll recall, when we were discussing council priorities, that was one of the reasons why we focused on code enforcement and perhaps increasing staffing in that area to allow for more proactive versus reactive enforcement.
Great. Well, then I'd like to turn that into a commercial for the addition of a code enforcement officer during our budget deliberations, and would encourage my colleagues to look at that very closely. Those of us that were on that tour on Friday can attest to the fact that there are many areas of blight along that tour, and much to my dismay, over the weekend as I drove around Ward 6, I spotted numerous code violations, piles of mattresses out on street corners and various garbage and other things. And I know, Barb, I've mentioned that to you, and Marjorie's going to check into them, but it's clear that it's not a one-person job anymore. And I do hope that we look carefully at that during the budget discussions. And then finally, let's see, was there another item here?
You can give us a little summary of the tour.
Yeah, I could give you a summary of the tour. One of the things that I think was most impressive to me was the data that was assembled by the city staff. And one of the amazing conclusions to be drawn from it is New Hampshire Avenue, as shabby as it appears on both sides, does not necessarily reflect the income levels of the people there at all of the major junctions of the area, including Ethan Allen and the Crossroads and Eastern Avenue. If you look at the numbers, people's income is fairly high. Yes, there are poor people there for sure, but the majority of them are classified in interesting ways, and most of them have incomes that would support far more retail than we see there, and certainly better housing than we see. And I think it probably points to the rule of shabby begets shabby. And the only way to turn that around is to promote the area to local developers so that they realize what the potential is. There's substantial potential along that corridor that has not been realized. And I think the second lesson to be drawn from the tour is that the different government entities that need to work together in order to make these things happen and to take advantage of these opportunities, finally they're coalescing. And there did seem to be agreement on the bus anyway. And the bus contained people who can really make things happen in the area from both Prince George's County side, Tacoma Park, and Montgomery County, that together we can not only come up with a plan that's viable, but fix the things that are fixable within our own capabilities. And finally, to press the state, and they have a huge role in the redevelopment of the area because they're the ones that will have to pay for the improvements on the streetscapes and the roadway, all of which need a lot of help. And I think now we have a critical mass there that is in agreement that an effort needs to be made to fix that area and to bring in some new development. So I thought it was very successful from those two standpoints, and we'll look forward, Barb, to the next meeting, which hopefully will take place within 30 days, when we will consult the same group that was there, and we will come up, the city will come up with its short list of priorities and discuss those with the folks who were there, and then develop an action plan as to where to go from that point. So all in all, it was very successful, and I would say that the redevelopment, the revitalization of the area has begun, and a huge step was taken with that tour on Friday. Thanks.
Joy, did you have any comments or announcements?
I was glad to join Doug Barry on the tour of New Hampshire Avenue and agree that things are definitely getting started, and I'm so glad to see it. I hope to be able to stay involved in that project both now and when I'm on the county council.
I just wanted to remind people about the May 16th pedestrian safety meeting that is going to be held here at 7 p.m. We are calling this a dialogue on pedestrian safety solutions. It's a meeting that involves both the county's Pedestrian Safety Advisory Committee, the city's Safe Roadways Committee, and the tri-jurisdictional pedestrian safety subcommittee of the Commission on Crossroads Development. I probably haven't gotten that last one quite right, but it's a meeting of the three groups. Part of the purpose of this meeting is for the three groups to talk about issues within Tacoma Park that affect pedestrian safety, and another purpose of the meeting is for people who live in the Tacoma Park area to be able to address these three groups with some of their pedestrian safety concerns, and hopefully to get some information about what you can do about issues and concerns you have about pedestrian safety. So I encourage people to come. There will be other agencies there who will be able to provide information. State Highway, I believe, is going to be invited, a number of other organizations. So I would encourage people to be there May 16th at 7, starting at, the room is open at 7 p.m. and the program begins at 7:30. So you can come at 7 p.m. and pick up brochures and that kind of thing, and the program will begin at 7:30.
Thanks, Mayor Porter. Just a couple of announcements. One event that's coming up in Ward 1 is that Dance Exchange, Liz Lerman's Dance Exchange, is reopening their studios, new and improved, and it's on Thursday night this week, starting at 7 p.m., I believe. They've invited community members to come and see their new space and to enjoy it along with them. So I hope people will avail themselves of that. Also, tomorrow morning is the Old Tacoma Business Association meeting. It starts at 8 a.m. with socializing and 9 a.m. with the meeting. Two other things that I want the City Council to be aware of. One is the County Council will be discussing and voting on a proposal to begin construction of a tiny piece of the Purple Line, where they would open a south entrance to the Bethesda Metro Station, and it would drill down and lay some of the groundwork that would be needed to get that project started. So from what I understand from George Leventhal, it looks very positive that the County Council is supporting that, and I'm excited to bring that news back to you, because I know this council has taken many positions in favor of the Purple Line, and it's nice to see that coming to fruition, as it were. The second thing is a more local impact, and that is that the Tacoma Park Elementary School is undergoing a feasibility study where they're looking at expanding the school, adding 12 classrooms, I believe, and getting rid of the portables that have been on site for quite a while. What this would mean is it would possibly change the traffic flow around the area. They're talking about a possible bus entrance to the school on Philadelphia into the property that right now has Morgan Daycare. The reason I bring this up is because if Morgan Daycare is displaced. I think that the city needs to reach out to them and possibly engage their school in a discussion with our recreation department and see if there are ways that the community center could accommodate that program. I believe it's early childhood education, and it may serve low-income families, and it's critical that we maintain that kind of service, probably very close to where they are now. So that's an opportunity for us also to have partners in programming our community center. The impacts on the neighborhood right now look like they may concentrate on Philadelphia and Holly, with car traffic going in on Holly and bus traffic going in on Philadelphia. So it may serve to solve some of the problems that we're aware of that exist with both car and bus traffic going in and out of the school entrance on Holly right now. Since it is an expansion of the school, it looks like people are fairly favorably inclined towards it, so I wanted the council to know, as it may raise some other issues that you may be asked about. But I believe in 3 weeks they have their next session as part of this feasibility study, and I will try to go to that one and then bring you back a report.
Any other comments? All right. We will now move on to the adoption of minutes. We have before us the minutes of April 17th. Does someone want to move adoption?
Move approval.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Are there any comments on the minutes? All those in favor of adopting the minutes, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The minutes are adopted. Next item on the agenda is the public comment period. This is the time that's set aside for comments on items that are not on the agenda. If you want to speak at either of the budget-related public hearings, those hearings will be later on. If you have a comment on an item that is not on our agenda or a discussion of an item on our work session agenda, this would be the appropriate time to make those comments. And I would ask both for the public comment period and for the public hearings, if when you come forward, you would identify yourself and give us some sense of where you live. That would be very helpful. Would anyone like to speak at the public comment period? Okay.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is John Emler, and I live at 7204 14th Avenue, Tacoma Park. And I don't come very often because sometimes I'm not sure we're getting a whole lot of improvement. We're trying like the devil, but we don't seem to get the police improvement or police coverage that we would like to have. And since we have a new officer tonight, maybe we can improve on that. But I'd like to suggest, until the city gets its complement of officers that we rely on, Montgomery County, ask them to come in and help. We've had far too many things happening in my neighborhood, and I have been living there for 44 years now, and I can say when I first moved, I did not lock my doors. Now I have 3 locks on every door, and every neighbor I know is very, very nervous. I guess with 3 minutes, I'll make a suggestion, a series of suggestions here. One, I think we could
sorry. That wasn't the end of your time.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Okay. As you know, Erskine Street is a major cut-through street, and we have had speed bumps put in, which did a very considerable job of slowing things down. However, they do have some big minuses, and if you live on that street and listen to a truck come through at 2 a.m. with something rattling around in the back, it will wake you right up. And fortunately, I don't have that because I'm just around the corner. But for the people on Erskine, it would be better, I think, to have traffic cameras. You would certainly more than make up the money, and it would slow down some of the traffic coming through there. The third item I would suggest is on 13th Street rather. It's a small, dimly lit street. There's only one street light, and we need more lights. That's one street we've had a considerable amount of crime on, and that's because it's so dark. 2 more street lights would be a big help, and preferably with the extra intensity lights that, like I have on in front of my house. Next time, well, the question of illegal aliens, I was going to discuss, but since it's on the agenda tonight on another thing, I'll drop that. But I always question why the city of Tacoma Park has to spend any money, any time, and do all the things it's doing for illegal aliens, as some people call them criminal aliens. Why not tend to the city's business and let the federal government, as bad as they are, do what they're supposed to do, and the city do what it's supposed to do?
You're correct, Mr. Emler. We will be discussing that later.
I'm sorry?
I say you're correct. We will be discussing that later.
Okay. The last 2 items, we had street improvements done. And generally, they did a better job on the second go-around than they did on the first. But we had this unfortunate problem in that the city's inspector had marked curb and gutter to be removed, and Lord, it needs to be removed. And your city tree man came through and said, no. There was absolutely no reason for him to do that. I've been in this business for 47 years now, and all you needed to do was put a thin form along the back that will disintegrate after the concrete's poured, and it would not have hurt those trees one iota. They're big maple trees, and we would have had new curb and gutter where it should have been. I would ask you now to go back at your next convenience and replace it, and you will have no problem at all with those trees.
Well, we can certainly take a look at that. I'm sorry, Mr. Emler, your time is up.
Okay, sorry.
Let me see if I can give you answers to some of those. Some of them I'm going to have to refer to the city manager because I don't know what the answer is. The city's police force, actually, we have fully staffed police patrols. We have managed to staff our patrols with the officers that we have. Most of the police agencies in this area are short officers, as Montgomery County is, short officers as we are. And we do provide mutual aid, and if there was a need for more officers than we had on patrol at a particular time, we could call on Montgomery County as they sometimes call on us. You had asked about the speed cameras issue. We are actually looking into speed cameras. I do think it would be a good idea, and we're going to be looking into that. And the street lights, I think perhaps we can ask maybe you and Mr. Berry to identify specifically where those street lights might go, and we can see if we can get some additional street lights installed. We do have some money. I don't know how many street lights we have requests for. We sort of start going down the list until we've essentially run out of the money we allocate for street lights.
Yeah, I might add, Mr. Emler, I did speak to the Public Works Director some time ago about another streetlight issue as part of the budget process, and my understanding is there is some funding remaining in this year's budget. So as the Mayor suggested, if you can perhaps communicate with Councilmember Berry, or certainly you can call me as well, and give me a sense of where you and your neighbors would like the lights, we'd be happy to take a look at that and put together a cost estimate and look at that for you.
That's 13th Place.
Okay.
It's a little short street, has one light on it now, loads of wall-to-wall parking. There's very few off-street parking places. And it's been a source of considerable crime, more on that one street than I think any other street in the community.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I do want to thank Mr. Emler for coming down tonight. It's kind of unusual that we have Ward 6 people coming to testify, but more of them have come lately. And for those watching on television, anyone from Ward 6 who comes to testify in the future, I'm taking them out for a glass of carrot juice after. They'll have the carrot juice. I'll drink something else. But I do appreciate you coming in. And Barb and I have been in contact about several other folks in your neighborhood, John, who have complained about crime issues there, and I think the Captain Corsi is looking into doing some outreach to folks there, and will reassure people that there will be patrols and that we're going to step up vigilance in that area.
The last couple of times it's been armed robberies, and once guns come into play, we all get a little bit nervous.
Yeah,
I can certainly understand that.
That's very understandable.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Anyone else? As I said, we will have our tax rate hearing and our budget public hearing following this, yes.
Marion McDormand, 8002 Maple. I just want to suggest to you that if you publish something in the newspaper about the time of a public hearing, that the public hearing be somewhat near that time. Because, I'm here tonight to speak about that, but I've been sick and I have children to get back to, and frankly, I can't stay past 9 o'clock, so I'm just very concerned that I will not be heard. So in the newspaper, it says the public hearing will be held at 7:30 p.m., so, if you could try to make what's in the newspaper be closer to reality, it'd be really great.
Well, the meeting goes along. We try and make it as accurate as we can. It probably should have said 7:30 or shortly thereafter. So apologies for that. Anyone else? All right. City manager's comments? Did you have anything?
Yes, just a couple items on the community center project. Would like to publicly express my appreciation to TRG Construction for getting the work in the lobby area done on time. Obviously, we were out of this room while that construction was ongoing, and I think they did an excellent job of getting us back here when we planned to. You may have noticed when you looked at the lobby area that there was no baseboard up. Apparently, when it did get shipped, it was the wrong product, so that will basically be addressed as a punch list item. They are aware of that, and they've reordered it. I also wanted to take this opportunity just to advise the public. There wasn't mention of this in the status and information report, but there are some repairs that James F. Knott Construction, which was the contractor for the first phase, needs to do on the front or the Maple Avenue parking lot. That work will basically get underway this Friday. Will take approximately 1 to 2 weeks. While that work is ongoing, there will be some rerouting again of parking for this facility. We will be maintaining handicap parking immediately in front of the police department. Those will be the only patrons to this building that will be allowed to park in that area just for their convenience. Other handicap parking is available on the Grant Avenue lot now that the elevator's back in service. And basically there is some spaces as well behind the building near the Computer Learning Center. Recognize this is rather inconvenient for the public to constantly be trying to guess where you park, and just appreciate your patience as we try to finish up this project in the next few weeks. Wanted to just mention to the council a couple other items related to Phase 2 that have come up. While TRG Construction was doing some work on the renovations of the restrooms on this floor for ADA purposes, they were doing some work in the police department. While that work was ongoing, basically it was plumbing work, we did note that there was an existing sewer line that was in bad repair. This is not related to the community center project. It was just something that was noted. In the interest of getting that work done while a plumber was on site, I did go ahead and authorize TRG Construction to do that. It will be an expense that will be charged to building maintenance, not to the project. But certainly the last thing anyone wants to do is have a dripping sewage line in any of the city facilities. Also, while we're trying to finish up Phase 2, there are some issues related to some of the doors in the police department area, the fire marshal, as part of this renovation process for Phase 2. I did comment on those. We will need to make some modifications to some of the locking systems with some of the doors within the police department itself. Those are required for fire code reasons. In a nutshell, it basically has to do with where you have padlocks and cipher locks and things like that in the event of a fire, to make sure that there would be an easy means of egress for anyone who is in the building. Obviously, the police department has been trying to balance that with making sure that there is security and that prisoners don't have a way to easily escape the building. So we're still continuing to work through those issues with the fire marshal. Some of these items will have some time associated with them. We are still well on pace to basically be done by the end of May. But basically, I did want to let the council know it may be a little bit more towards the end of the month than the middle of the month because of some of those issues. Unrelated to the community center project, just an update on a few items, and I will try to keep this quick because I recognize there are people here for some of the public hearings. We are still working with TRG Construction in terms of getting a remote card reader system for Hefner. That will require a separate building permit to be pulled because it is a separate facility. It would not be covered under TRG Construction's work for this building. Anytime you are pulling a permit, there is a review by other applicable county agencies. It does appear that the installation of a remote card reader system at Hefner will require some modifications to either the door itself or to the door hardware for fire code reasons. So we're still kind of working through those issues. The council may recall on a different subject that we were working with Lardner Klein to get a proposal, working with the Park Avenue neighbors. This is related to 7118 Carroll. We did receive an updated proposal from Lardner Klein. I forwarded that to the neighbors last week. Miriam Shapiro was kind enough to kind of get input from everyone, and I received that when I arrived at work this morning. We'll be reviewing those comments with Lardner Klein to see what we can do to address their concerns, and obviously I'll keep the council updated as that moves forward. There's been a mention a number of times this evening about the New Hampshire Avenue tour, and want to thank those council members who were able to attend. I realize some of you had conflicts and were unable to do so. Would like to particularly express my appreciation to Sarah Dames, Alana Blanchard, and David Sewells, who did a tremendous amount of work preparing for the tour. There's been some mention already about next steps. As I told the tour participants, what I would like to do sometime in the next 30 to 45 days is have those individuals who are on the tour and representatives from some of the Montgomery County departments as well as Prince George's County meet with our planning staff again as a follow-up once they've had an opportunity to think about what they saw on the tour, read some of the statistical data, and basically kind of all put our heads together to see what the next steps should be. There has been a considerable amount of study of the New Hampshire Avenue corridor. I think it's been studied to death, if you will, and there's been a lot of suggested implementation steps. I think, as Councilmember Berry mentioned, I think the next step in the process is to sort of develop some perhaps short-term, mid-term, and long-term steps, and basically have an opportunity to discuss those with both the residential property owners as well as some of the commercial property owners. As Councilmember Berry mentioned, the state of Maryland, particularly SHA, will be a key player in this. And we just take this opportunity to also note for the council that you play an important role in this process as we move forward. There's certainly a lot that we can do at a staff level, but quite often, particularly with some of the elected officials at both the county levels as well as the state, they're much more likely to be responsive to you all as fellow elected officials than they will be to staff. So as we move forward in this process, staff will certainly let you know what we need from you, and some of your, I guess, political will and lobbying power will likely be needed. The last item I had is just to mention that I think the council is aware of this, but the Crossroads Commission, which had been dormant for some time, has recently been reactivated. Councilmember Berry and I both serve as two of at least of the city's representatives on that commission. The plan is for the full commission to basically meet on a bi-monthly basis. There are a number of functioning subcommittees to the Crossroads Commission that will basically meet on the off months, and I am serving on the Day Laborer Commission or subcommittee, and our next meeting will be tomorrow. So certainly as our work continues, I'll be keeping the council updated on what's going on at the commission level, as I'm sure Councilmember Berry will.
Okay. Bruce?
Yeah. Barb, I have three quick questions on the community center. Maybe I didn't hear you quite right, but you were explaining the options for parking for handicap access as JFK works on the front lot. Did you mention where everybody else has to park?
Everybody else basically will need to park in the rear of the building.
Okay. And any update on any timing on the borings and on the potential for RFP for a consultant for the gym?
Vanita George has been in contact with ECS. She was out of the office today, so I didn't have the opportunity to get an update from her. They are basically getting that on their schedule. In regard to the RFP for the conceptual design services, I've had a meeting with Suzanne Ludlow. I'm going to be turning that over to her. I anticipate that should go out probably sometime within the next couple weeks.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Barb, for your continued attention to the community center. We are in very good hands, and I appreciate the time you spend on this. I would like to ask your help with the Carroll Avenue streetscape. I continue to hear from residents who are very concerned that there are a couple of unfinished jobs. One is a big hole that is collecting water, and as we move into mosquito season, that's what's on everyone's mind. So if that could be addressed as soon as possible, I'd appreciate it. The other things I know about are the weeds that need to be addressed, pulled, replanted, mulched. There's a variety of options that I believe Alana Blanchard has discussed with the neighbors, but they're expecting action very soon, and I just want to make sure that Alana has the resources to take that action as soon as possible.
Yeah, I'll be certainly happy, Councilmember Austin-Lane, to give personal attention to that and see what we can do to get it done for you.
I appreciate it.
Any other council questions?
The last item I just wanted to mention, and I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions, included in your agenda packet is my quarterly report of basically staff activities from January 1st to March 31st, as well as a financial report for that same time period. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If not, that concludes my report.
Thank you. At this point, we will move on to the two budget-related public hearings. The first is a hearing on the constant yield tax rate. And I'd like to begin by reading the notice that we published in the newspaper of record. The City of Tacoma Park, the City Council of the City of Tacoma Park, Maryland, proposes to increase real property taxes for the tax year beginning July 1st, 2006. The estimated real property assessable base will increase by 9.9% from $1,163,361,412 to $1,278,931,719. If the City of Tacoma Park maintains the current tax rate of 63 cents per $100 assessment, real property tax revenues will increase by 9.9%, resulting in $728,093 of new real property tax revenues. In order to fully offset the effect of increasing assessments, the real property tax rate should be reduced to 57.3 cents, the constant yield property tax rate. The city is considering not reducing its real property tax rate enough to fully offset increasing assessments. The city proposes to adopt a real property tax rate of 63 cents per $100 of assessment. This tax rate is 9.9% higher than the constant yield rate and will generate $728,093 in additional property tax revenues. And I should add that we will have a public hearing on this topic immediately, and the final city tax rate will be set at the time the budget is passed in late May or early June. I believe it's currently scheduled for the first Monday in June, but that could change as we get closer to the date. Is there anyone who would like to testify on the constant yield tax rate? I've got two people who are signed up so far. Marion McDormand and Abdul Amin Mohammed. Yes.
Hi, I'm Marion McDormand. I oppose this, effective increase. I mean, it is an increase even though it's not really, it's an increase because the assessed values went up. And taxes in the City of Tacoma Park are higher than any other place in Montgomery County by far. You pay about twice as much here as just across the creek from me in the unincorporated portion of Silver Spring. I don't think it's fair that we have to pay so much more than our neighbors. And it's a real severe hardship for me and my family, and I think for a lot of families. I have what I consider to be an average single-family house on Maple Avenue, and I'm paying in excess of $7,500 in property tax last year. And if you're going to be increasing it every year, it just goes up, and I can't afford to pay $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a year for property taxes. And I love Tacoma Park. I love the community. I've been very involved with the community, but, you know, I'm thinking about following several of my neighbors that I know who have moved out of the city in the past 5 years for one reason and one reason only, because they can't afford to pay the property taxes. And they've moved to places like in the unincorporated portion of Silver Springs, places within 5 miles of us, and they continue to be involved in the community, but they just can't pay the taxes. And I've spoken here before, previous years, you know, I don't think I've ever been faced with this big of an increase as a proposal. It's 9.9%. But it seems like at this point, it's been increased and increased and increased every year that I come down here, even though I always argue that it shouldn't be. And even to do constant yield at this point is a severe hardship for me and my family. So I don't know what else to say, but, you know, I appreciate that the city provides services. I appreciate some of the problems that the city has in not having a lot of revenue from commercial properties. However, at this point, I would be happy to see cuts in services rather than having to pay more so that I have to move. Because these wonderful services are not going to do me any good at all if I can't be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to? Abdul Aman Mohammed, would you like to testify also?
My name is Dr. Rahman Mohammed. I live in Maple Avenue. I've been a resident of Tacoma Park for the last almost 13, 14 years. It's a great place to live, a great place to raise a family. However, like what Marian was saying, you know, for some of us, our income is not growing that much, and it's becoming extremely expensive living in Tacoma Park. I would like the council to consider what Marian has said and other people who have not come here, but it's been a concern to a lot of people. I have known people who have moved out of Tacoma Park, not very far, just 1 or 2 blocks on each side, and pay half of what we are paying. And I'm just raising my concern. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to this issue?
Alan Carey, 716 Erie Avenue. First, I know there's been work done in the building, and it must have been very dusty. But I notice everything for the council is pretty clean. It would have been a nice sign of respect to basically dust the thing for the residents. I can only agree with the 2 people who talked before. The difference between today and this year and last year is there is no election. So we're basically bearing the full brunt of the increase. I am shocked. 9.9% in increase, okay? Okay, by your calculation, it makes for a 5% overall increase in budget, in revenues. However, I look, the expenditures increased by 9.4%. And when I looked at the budget, and I looked at it pretty carefully, I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, I will talk about that later in the second part. But there are lots of things that are not even included in there. I mean, it's just like, what are we paying for? I mean, this is just for regular things. And basically, we have to pay 9.9% additional every year. This is a ratchet effect. Because let's say that in 3 years, the property values goes down. It's possible. Then you will increase the rate from 63 to 66, 70, because you will need to basically pay for your pattern of expenditures. In a period of fat cows, you keep on increasing the budget, and in a period of meager cows, you're probably going to keep on increasing it at the same time. This is absolutely insane. It has been going on for years. I agree completely with the 2 people who talked before. I'm glad there are 2 people that came tonight, because generally I've been the only one here making the point, and I'm considered a Republican, which I'm not. But basically, I have exactly the same problem. I'm considering leaving. I've been living here 17 years. I made my house here, and I'm considering leaving because basically I don't see why I should pay about twice as much rent, taxes, for what? Don't tell me that people who live across from Mississippi are getting services that are half the ones that they get on Mississippi. The ones that are living across Flower from me, I live on Erie, close to Flower, are getting half the services that I get. That's not true.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? All right. If there's no one else, I call this public hearing to a close. We'll now open the public hearing on the proposed fiscal 2007 budget. I've got a couple people who have signed up here. Raymond Hill is the first person, and then John Emler. I don't know if he's still here. It looks like he's left. Raymond Hill.
Been some time since I've been in this building, since Mayor Abbott and others have left. But I have one problem I'd like to bring up, and there are a multitude of problems, but I mentioned the problem of trees. I know Tacoma Park values its trees, and I used to work for a tree company, Stark Brothers Nurseries and Orchards Company. I planted several trees, not only here, but some other places, and I appreciate trees, what they can do, how they purify the air and the atmosphere. But there comes a time when trees, like people, must pass away, and particularly those that lean over the street and present a hazard to passing motorists and children and employees of the city, and cause destructive damage in $1,000. I know it costs about $1,000 to take a tree, big tree down, one of these big oak trees, and several neighbors have done that. But it appears to me maybe the city could help with some of that, with the excess money they have and the budget, and maybe it's not excess the way some of you think you get other uses. But I know that my one neighbor across the street from where I live, I talked to his daughter. He said the tree will be there was there for 38 years. It'll be there for 38 more years. Well, that's not so, because sometimes trees depart from this life, like you and I depart from this life. And so there comes a time when the danger outweighs the cost, and the tree must be removed. I know that some people can't afford it, so however, the question is, if one of their relatives dies, now this lady who lives in the house of her father, I said to her, suppose the tree falls on your head, then what? It costs maybe $1,000 or more to take it down, but then you have automobiles you got to pay for, $25,000 or $30,000 new cars parked under that tree. So there comes a time when not only this tree that I'm talking about, but other trees constitute a hazard to life, liberty, and property. Some people one man has been killed, I read, and around here, if you suppose you have a 100-mile-an-hour wind, it's possible to have it like they have down in Tennessee and other places. They have terrific winds here too, so count that as dangerous, and take into consideration that God, I pray that we'll never like that never happen. But who knows? I'm not God, and neither are any of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? It doesn't look like it at this point. Thank you, Mr. Hill.
Alan Terry, 716 Avery Avenue. As many of you know, I've been following the budget very carefully over the last few years. Since we had a new city manager, I was hopeful there would be improvements. The first year, the city manager had to deal with the mess, the accounting mess left by the previous one, and that was okay. But now we have a second budget, and I look at it and I say, it's very disappointing. Why? Well, it's presented much more professionally than the previous one, but that's hardly a compliment. What is it? It's a budget that basically is purely administrative. We have these departments, these sub-departments, and that's what the money we allocate. Why do we allocate money to them? What do they do? What programs do they do during the year? We don't know. I look at this, I have no idea. How many miles of roads are going to be repaired? How many miles of roads are going to be rehabbed? None. Library. Library, what is it? Is it an adult library? Is it a children's library? We don't know. We put money there. That's it. My wife, for example, went to the library on several occasions because she's trying to change jobs and looking for basically what you find in any libraries. Where's your golden parachute and all that kind of books? Couldn't find them. Okay? I mean, maybe golden parachute is not a bad example, but she couldn't find basic books. She went to Montgomery Library. She found them there. So I look at the city manager's report. I see community-oriented policing. What is this animal? I don't see a cop in my neighborhood, ever. What is it? I mean, can't we have, like, what is supposed to be done? Recreation. How many kids are supposed to be basically enrolled? In what? What for? And et cetera. None. The corollary of this is at the end of every year we get a financial report, but we certainly never get an activities report. We have no way of knowing what the performance is. Okay? That is the major flaw in the budget. It's a strictly administrative thing, like, well, everything is fine. Second, the budget as it is presented, I mean, as I mentioned, 9.9% increase in taxes, overall budget of 5.6%, and basically, according to the report, a $1 million deficit. Wow, that's in a fat area.
Can you wind up your comment?
I'll take my time if you allow me. I don't come that often. Okay? Second, the budget has also some flaws. If I look at the full-time equivalent, for example, I see an increase of 3.5%. That's not true. It is 4%. No, not 3.5 position. It is 4 position. Why? Because the budget, there's a very sleight of hand there. The city engineer is put half-time on the stormwater fund, okay? It is not included. When you see the full-time positions, it is not included in there. It's been removed out of the general fund. Now, what is the logic? I mean, there's an increase in the stormwater fund of $40 that's coming, okay? And the total budget for the stormwater fund is $370,000. Public Works is $3.5 million, and you put the city manager half-time on the stormwater fund? Come on. This is basically sleight of hands. And other things. This is a budget that is misleading as hell. You already went to the state, and you're supposed to have some matching funds for the money that you got for the gym. Not a word of it. Okay? And you know it's coming. You have it in your mind that it's coming. No way. It's not included. So, I mean, basically what you're presenting is kind of a joke. Okay? I come here, I spend my time, I do my good effort, but basically, you've already decided, right? It's a sham.
Clarify the matching.
I think we're going to get to that part of it when we're going to discuss the community center fund at a later part in the budget.
But could we address the issue of the matching funds? We have the 750 from Washington at Venice, we have 360 from the state, and we've sought 360 from the county.
Right, that's correct.
Did you know that?
Yeah, this should be in the budget. They're not.
Does the city manager want to address that issue?
The question for us.
Yeah, I mean, obviously what the budget reflects is what the council or the city intends to expend in FY07. It is not an accounting of every revenue source. It's basically a timing issue. As the council may recall, and as is indicated in the budget transmittal message, at this point, the only financial commitment the council has made was to do a feasibility study, and once you get that cost information, to make a decision about the gym project. As was indicated in the transmittal message, at the time this was done, which obviously the budget was released almost a month ago, basically the only thing that is reflected at this time is the program open space funds, which the council had passed a resolution to use much of that allocation towards the gym project. The program open space program does have a 25% match that is reflected in the budget as an operating transfer from the general fund to the community center fund, and it is so noted in the budget.
One thing about the gym part of this project is I've been very clear that the community hasn't yet weighed in, and my council colleagues have assured me that we will get to that point where we're asking for them to weigh in once we have an array of funding sources, and we're also looking at federal funding. We've applied through Chris Van Hollen for some appropriations from the federal level, where we've had our weakest partnership up to now. The second thing is that the feasibility study that Barb mentioned is something where we need very specific information about what different options would cost before we present it to the public and ask them to help us give us input about what they'd like to see. So until we have that information, I understand my colleague's position that it's difficult for us to ask the public for input.
It is difficult also
Let me-
to tell how much
let me-
features you're going to get. So
Let me
please give
suggest
include
that the council not occupy the time for the public hearing on the proposed budget. We will have an opportunity to discuss all of these parts of the budget, but this is supposed to be a public hearing.
But, I mean, it's a public hearing, we only have like 3 or 4 people in the audience. I mean, it's not like we're being overwhelmed with people who are going to lose their turns. And I think, I don't see any harm in at least clarifying, because I think he raised the point about where the money shows up. And so, for example, if we do have money coming from the state, will we not get the money unless the city commits to the project, or will we get the money this year and then be in a position to have to give it back if we don't use it on the gym?
The state bond bill funds, as the council may recall, are on a reimbursement basis. Until the city actually makes an expenditure and can file for reimbursement, there are no funds that will be received from the state, and therefore they would not be recorded in the city's accounting system.
So any of that money which is hypothetical but doesn't exist until we actually do something, and there is no account to put it in because we don't have the money and there's no place to hold it?
No, it basically is accounted for, Councilmember Elrich, when it will actually be received. So same thing with Washington Adventist Hospital. They've made a pledge of $750,000. However, if you'll recall, that's going to be $150,000 over 5 years. You would never show that as revenue in a single year, because that's not how it's going to be paid.
No, but if they had given us a check, we would have showed that the money came in.
That's correct.
And there would be a fund set up where the money would be held to balance it.
Except that having worked in a treasury operation at one point, and if somebody basically makes a commitment for $360,000, okay, and then reneges on it, I have problems. Because I basically borrowed that money, and I don't know where to place it. So basically, the fact that you went to the state is already a sign of commitment.
It's not a sign of commitment, and I'd like to give someone else a chance to speak. Is there anyone else that would like to speak on our budget public hearing? Anyone else?
Then I'd like to provide a clarification.
Okay, go ahead, provide a clarification.
I would just like to say that I would disagree with my colleague who said that the public has not had a chance to weigh in on the gym. I'd just like to point out that the public has had numerous chances to weigh in on the gym, and that there will continue to be those opportunities.
Could you sit beside them?
Yes. If there's no one else who would like to testify in the budget public hearing, I will bring this public hearing to a close, and we will go to the next item on the agenda. The next item on the agenda is consideration of a resolution supporting passage of comprehensive immigration reform and opposing enforcement-only immigration legislation. Would you like to speak to this, Mark?
Yeah, this legislation is modeled on the resolution that is being passed around the country, and most recently in Baltimore. And I'd been asked if we could get it done by Monday, which was the most relevant day last week. But Kathy pointed out we should have this advertised for a week before it appeared on the agenda, and I thought that was a good point, and so it's set for another week. It's basically calls on taking an approach toward immigration that looks at all the broad issues in immigration, does not focus simply on enforcement and removing people or building walls or anything else. And I thought, given the city's long history of involvement, we're a sanctuary city. I mean, our involvement in being a place where refugees could feel safe to come actually goes back to the 1980s and to the wars in Central America, and that's why Tacoma Park declared itself a sanctuary city back then. So I think it's consistent with the kind of positions we've taken in the past. Cities early on had a position where we were not, for example, providing information to the INS, through routine traffic stops. We've tried to avoid the kind of hardcore approach that's advocated by some in Congress, and I wanted to put this resolution forward in support of the efforts of people to get comprehensive reform and not just simply the heavy hand approach to immigration.
I assume you're moving the resolution.
So I'll move.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Bruce?
And I'd just like to point out, Mark, you weren't here when there was a comment during public comment earlier in the meeting, and the gentleman was saying that what we really need is for the federal government to provide the reforms necessary, and it was their job to do it. And I'd just like to point out to him, if he were still here, that this resolution does that and asks the federal government to step up and do what needs to be done.
I think it's also worth noting, and I know that this is an issue that's created a lot of differences of opinion in our country about immigration. And I know that there's a lot of animosity toward people who enter our country without color of law. But it is true that our economy right now depends on a number of immigrants, including larger numbers of immigrants than can currently enter the country legally. And so we have a very peculiar situation right now where, for the sake of our economy, we need a certain number of people, and yet our immigration policy does not allow for the entrance of that many people. And so there are businesses who are pushing for more generous immigration policy so that they can continue to run their businesses. I think this is something that the federal government needs to take a very careful look at and come up with a more rational policy than is currently being pursued at this point. Right now, we are spending huge amounts of enforcement money trying to keep out people that we need. And on the other hand, you have businesses that are attempting to operate with people who enter the country illegally. And so I think it's a situation that really begs for some rationality and a better way of operating. I've also, within the past month, been part of a Council of Governments-sponsored forum on day labor issues, and that's sort of the issue that sparked some of the controversy about immigration in this area. And I think it's worth noting that as local government officials, we can speak out on national immigration policy, and I think we have a responsibility to speak out on national immigration policy. But it doesn't mean, as was suggested by the gentleman earlier, that we then have a responsibility to ignore the issue of day laborers gathering in a place where it creates difficulties for surrounding businesses. We have a responsibility to maintain public order by providing a place for people who are looking for work to gather at a location that does not have adverse impacts on the surrounding businesses. And I think that the city has taken a very responsible position in that regard and is trying to do the right thing and create a better situation than we found ourselves dealing with initially. And so I'm very much in support of that resolution. I think the federal government taking a more rational approach to immigration policy could also help local governments like ours, as well as helping the entire economy of our country.
I just had one other comment that I think that it's easy to misunderstand the complexity of the issue when using imprecise language, and that in many cases the shorthand is undocumented workers, and I think in many cases those workers are documented. They came into the country legally, and they may have overstayed the time which they were allowed to stay here. They're documented. It's just a question of dealing with the fact that those documents are no longer valid. And it's not a question of everybody in question entering the country illegally. They may have entered legally. They're here now, and therefore they're living in our community. They are our neighbors. They are people who do work for us and our neighbors, and we can't just ignore their plight.
Yes, I support this ordinance. Support the resolution. Too bad it couldn't be an ordinance. Support it because we've seen the ugly face of xenophobia and nativism in this area, in Herndon, in Wheaton, and even to a certain extent here on the borders of Tacoma Park. It's mean, it's ugly, and therefore a more comprehensive approach to immigration reform is needed. And in the longer term, we must look at assisting Mexico and other countries in Central America, help to reform their economies, build their economies, so that there will not be a need for thousands of people to seek opportunity north of their border. It's going to take a while. It's not going to be something that we're going to resolve overnight. But I do think in the meantime that we need to remind people in this area that xenophobia and nativism, as we have seen in other periods of our history where a large number of immigrants have come to these shores, is not the American way. It's not the right way. And therefore, this resolution is important.
I also support this resolution and think that it continues to gain momentum for a movement that is clearly supported by our residents. The diversity we have here in Tacoma Park is something that everyone defends, and I'm thrilled to make a public statement about that. I think that we have nothing to gain but good things by protecting the civil rights of all of our neighbors. So I'm glad to support this resolution.
Are there any public comments? All right.
I just wanted to say one thing. I think honest people can disagree and debate the economics and all the other policy issues. But the thing that's most striking to me is that when you use a number like 11 or 12 million and you talk about removing them from the country, you're talking about removing 1 out of every 25 people from the country and moving them someplace else. And that just strikes me as an obscene thought, that we would go around and remove 1 out of every 25 people living in this country and making it a home, and that we would somehow deport them and send them over a border. I mean, aside from the fact that it's a logistical nightmare, I think the social disruption and the pain that something like that would cause just is not American. It's not the kind of thing we should be associated with.
Okay. The resolution is in front of the council. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The resolution passes. The next resolution on our agenda is a resolution supporting Bike to Work Day. May 19th is Bike to Work Day. It's a event that is co-sponsored by the Washington Area Bicyclist Coalition, WABA. along with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Commuter Connections programs, and it is designed to encourage bicycling to work. On Friday, May 19th, there will be a series of, they're called pit stops, which is areas around the metropolitan area which provide people who want to participate in this with breakfast, entertainment, prizes, and if you register by the 12th of May, you can get a free T-shirt. The pit stops in our area are in Bethesda, Bowie, College Park, Frederick, La Plata. La Plata's not that close. You could probably not bicycle there. North Bethesda, Rockville, and Silver Spring. So we have in front of us a resolution supporting Bike to Work Day and declaring the 19th as Bike to Work Day in Tacoma Park.
Move it.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any council comments?
I'm going to be participating in Bike to Work Day, and it'll be the first time I think
From La
I'll be...
Plata?
No. No. And I asked our new bike shop owner from Tacoma Park Bikes, and said he wasn't quite ready this year, but maybe next year he can be one of the sponsors, and we'll have a stop downtown. And I wanted to put in a plug for our new Tacoma Park bike shop. I've been there several times now and bought a helmet and had my scooter repaired and new tires and gloves, and it's a great place. So.
Where is that shop?
It's in the house where Amano used to be, and now Amano's moved next door. So it's kind of a purple-colored house. I had a comment about this. One thing that this annual resolution does for me is help mark our progress towards bike trails, and I'm proud that Metropolitan Branch Trail is in place in our very own Tacoma Park. I'm also pleased that the Silver Spring area is beginning to see activity on the building of the Metropolitan Branch Trail that will connect it to other trails, and all of this is very welcome progress.
Any other comments? Any public comments on this resolution? Seeing none, the vote is on establishing May 19th as Bike to Work Day in Tacoma Park. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The resolution passes. The next item on our agenda is a resolution recognizing Police Week and Peace Officers Memorial Day. The week of May 15th has been designated as National Peace Officers Memorial Day, and that week has been designated as National Police Week. Actually, May 15th is Police Officers Memorial Day, and the week is National Police Week. And this recognizes this week and also notes that this is a time to mark the passing of police officers and those who have been killed in the line of duty.
Move the resolution.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded, yes.
Yeah, I would just note that on the news tonight, it appears that there were potentially a couple of police officers killed in Fairfax County, and that was, I believe, the first ones that they had in their history who were shot and killed. They'd had some who died in car accidents, but shot in the line of duty. And I've had the honor of speaking at the national commemoration down at the Peace Officers Memorial, and it's a very moving memorial, and people should go take a look at it.
Yeah, the first year that I was here in Washington, D.C., I happened upon the memorial the week that this was going on, and I would agree with Bruce that it is something to see, and people come from all over the country, and the motorcyclists come in and are parked all around the area, and it is really something to see and to go experience.
I also wanted to note that on May 13th, which is the Saturday before this week, there will be a wreath laying at Totley Fraser Park in memory of Ed Totley, who was a Maryland state officer who died in the line of duty while pursuing those who sold drugs in Tacoma Park. He was an undercover officer and died in the line of duty when he was shot by a drug suspect. And there will be a wreath laying in his memory. Is there any additional comment? Is there any public comment? All right, the resolution is in front of the council. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The resolution passes. Next item on the agenda is a resolution of support for junior achievement of the National Capital Area, their Unlimited Futures project. Is there somebody who wants to speak? It's been moved.
Second.
And seconded. Is there somebody who wants to speak to this?
The Junior Achievement of the National Capital Area has requested this resolution for an allocation of state tax credits. The Unlimited Futures is a partnership project with Montgomery County Public Schools, and it's designed to teach skills and competencies to enter the workforce. The project has been allocated an initial $22,500 in tax credits from the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development Department. And basically, as part of that process, the state does require approval of the local municipality who have schools within the funding area.
And I note that both Piney Branch and Rolling Terrace are sites for junior achievement. Piney Branch is actually located within the city limits. Rolling Terrace is just outside, but has a population of students, some of which are Tacoma Park residents.
And some teachers who we know.
Yes, that's also quite true. This sounds like a very good project, which could be a lot of benefit to young people in Tacoma Park, and I'm happy to support it.
I just wanted to add to that probably the weakest link in the school system is how kids are prepared for entering the work world. If you're going on to college, Montgomery County Schools does a pretty reasonable job of getting you ready to go on to college. The kids who are not going to college are the ones that are probably leaving school right now least prepared for going into the workforce, and it's an area that the school system and others need to, I think, pay more attention to, because we don't do enough in the schools to develop the skills people need to work, and the emphasis is always on, are you going to college, are you going to college? And for a lot of the kids, that's not where they're going to be. They might go to a junior college and work while they're trying to get their credits together and make it into a full-time college. So I think this is a good project and worth pursuing.
Are there any public comments on this resolution? All right, seeing none, the resolution is in front of the council. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The resolution passes. And the final item on our regular meeting agenda is the second reading of the ordinance, which authorizes a contract with our consultant who is doing transportation work related to the Tacoma Metro development.
Good evening. This is the same resolution that we discussed last week with one amendment. Apparently, these kinds of ordinances normally take effect 20 days after passage. I've requested that they be effective immediately because we do not know when WMATA may issue plans that this consultant would need to review. So this would be in approval of an ordinance on second reading, including the amendment that's noted, that the ordinance shall be effective immediately. I did pass along the information to Lorraine Pearsall and Sabrina Barron, as they requested last week, and asked for comments, and they have not responded, so I'd like to pass that information along.
Yeah, my understanding was that when they got a chance to, that the group who's looking at the Tacoma Metro issues have had a chance to look at the preliminary report that was done, and I haven't gotten any comments back from them either. So I'm assuming that there's not a problem.
Not a problem on the preliminary report?
Right. Well, I mean, not a problem in terms of this contract.
Oh, right. No, this contract is terrifically timed. I'm so pleased that the City Council is being proactive on this issue, and I think that having experts to analyze the materials as soon as it comes out is exactly what we need. And as a city, we have a long history with this project, and I think have been behind the curve at certain times, and this is representing a change, in my view, from that. I would like to say a word about the report that the mayor just mentioned. People were concerned about the report from the March 4th planning meeting because it portrayed the general feel of the people who participated as being 50% in favor of EYA's proposal and 50% having a variety of other views.
I think we're talking about a different report.
That's not the report that this was referring to.
Oh, this is talking about the report that we had them do?
Right. That's correct.
Okay. Sorry
yes,
about that.
This doesn't have anything to do with what WMATA issued. This
Okay,
was
but actually my point
workshop.
does. My point does.
Okay.
My point is that when, because the summary of that March 4th planning session was somewhat skewed, but in actuality a little bit more favorable than public portrayals have been of the sentiment of the community in previous times where we were told that the majority of people or almost everyone supported the EYA proposal. At least we're getting back to some semblance of reality here. And what it is incumbent on WMATA at this point, having finally had a planning session on the metro development, these many years after their initial proposal, request for proposals, and recent contract with EYA being completed, it is incumbent on them to now revise what we've been looking at for 6 years. So if what they send to us and say that they're going to hold a compact hearing on is in fact the same thing that we've been looking at for the last 6 years, we need immediate attention to that, and the City Council really needs to seriously consider a lawsuit at this time. The WMATA public process has been abysmal. The planning session that they had on March 4th is a turn in the right direction, and I want to make sure that it's not too little too late by being poised and ready to take action if that's what's necessary. If we let this proceed to the compact hearing, I am fairly certain that we will end up with the 90 townhouse unit proposal that EYA has put before us, the same one for the last 6 years. So I look forward to council action on this as soon as we get WMATA's proposal.
Can I suggest that we deal with the ordinance in front of us first, which is the hiring of the consultant? Does someone want to move the ordinance?
So moved.
Second.
I thought it had my name on it already.
Well, it does, but that was from the first reading. You had moved it
Okay,
to the first
so I
reading,
moved
so you're
it
moving it
again.
to second reading. And are you moving it with the addition of Section 3, which is the
Effective
ordinance?
immediately.
Of course.
All right. So, and was that your second also?
Mhm.
Okay, good. Just wanted to clarify. All right. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I want to add 3 things to the mix that I attended WMATA's briefing for the Silver Spring Metro Transit Center, and they said 3 things that I thought were amazingly relevant. One is they're doubling the bus bays in the transit center, and they apologize for being conservative in their projections of future ridership, but they said they didn't want to go out, and if they did more than doubling the bus bays, some people might think that was extreme, and that they didn't want to be building bus bays for, and then discover they didn't need them. So in Silver Spring, they're doubling the bus bays. But it gets better. Then they said,
Maybe they were assuming that all the buses that were going to normally go to Tacoma Metro are going to end up in Silver Spring.
could be. This quote I really liked. It says, if development got in the way of our goal, which is transit, the development would have to go. So here we've been arguing that this thing needs to serve primarily as a transit center. It needs to develop as a transit center first, and then the development should fit around the transit center. To the Silver Spring community a couple weeks ago, it was, and they were shown a hotel and 2 condo towers on the site, and they were like, well, if this doesn't work, then the development would have to go in order to provide the transit service, because that's what Metro is all about, WMATA is all about. And then they were talking about the park in Silver Spring, which is not much of a park, any of you have been to the Metro there. And they said that it was critically important for current and future use to develop open space and amenities for users, and that they're going to enhance the park on the site and increase its size. So in Silver Spring, the rhetoric is completely different. It's that the park is essential, the open space is essential, it needs to be enhanced, it needs to have all these other features added to it. So over there, it's one story. And at Tacoma Park, these 3 stories are played out completely differently. So I think it's important that whoever the consultants are, that they look at WMATA's plan in Silver Spring and ask the question, why aren't we being treated the way Silver Spring's being treated? Because I couldn't believe what I heard in this meeting. It just took me totally back. I was forced to take notes.
Is that an EYA development in Silver Spring?
Oh, no, it's the favorites. It's Folger.
And what's the difference between the size of the area that's to be developed?
I don't know the acreage. You know, I mean, you know the.
Estimate, like
well,
3 times as big, 2 times as big?
I don't think the metro with the parking area here probably is not 3 times as big. I mean, the Silver Spring thing is probably not 3 times as big because you've got the bus bays that go in and the ride-on area.
Right. The issue at Silver Spring is not that the acreage is so much larger, but that everything's done in layers. So you've got buses up above on one layer, and you've got trail and a variety of different layers.
And everything around it is also higher, so if they built.
And the station is low. Yeah, topographically.
Yeah. It was very striking. I mean, they're basically condensing the footprint of the transit center, different than what they originally told people the transit center was going to be in Silver Spring. And it's being compressed, and a lot of the green space and people thought was going to be there is disappearing. And in exchange, Folger gets 2 huge condo towers and a big hotel tower.
Well, but
And no elevator access.
I appreciate the information on Silver Spring. I think your point is exactly right, that our consultants should look at what's being done in Silver Spring and ask the very obvious question, why aren't those same principles guarded in Tacoma Metro development? Are there any other council questions or comments? Are there any public comments on this ordinance? This being the second reading of the ordinance, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Porter?
Aye.
Councilmember Austin-Lane?
Aye.
Councilmember Barry?
Aye.
Councilmember Clay?
Aye.
Councilmember Elliott?
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens? Councilmember Williams?
Aye.
The ordinance passes its second reading. At this point, the council will take a brief recess and come back for our 2 work session items. one is a discussion of the installation of the elevator cab, community center elevator cab.
As the council is aware, an elevator shaft was installed as part of phase one of the community center construction, but the actual cab installation was deferred. This is an issue we've been kind of talking about for some time. I think as the building has been open for a longer period of time, I think it's become at least fairly apparent, I think, to the staff that having just one elevator on the rear side of the building creates some access issues for certain visitors to the building. We did some preliminary research as a staff just in terms of what the cost of a cab might be. Obviously, there's other things associated with the installation, including electrical work and some drywall work and other types of subcontractor work. So we approached TRG Construction, the contractor for the second phase of the project, to see what type of proposal we could get from them in terms of putting the actual cab in. Those initial discussions focused on the original project specifications going back to 2003, which called for an 8-foot high elevator cab. There are some code requirements, which I won't bore you with, but basically it has to do with the distance that is required from the top finished floor above our heads to the top of the shaft. In order to put in an 8-foot high cab, that would require some structural modifications to the building, and as the council can imagine, that would be very costly. The project management team then sort of regrouped, kind of talked about it, and has identified an alternative elevator cab design that would not require any structural modifications to the building, and as a result would be considerably less costly. This elevator cab, and I talked to the elevator company earlier today, and they did some more refined calculations from what was in the proposal included in the agenda packet. This cab would actually be 7 feet 5 inches in height, so it's about 2 inches higher, based on my conversation with them this morning, than what was indicated in the agenda package and in their proposal. The doors to the elevator would be 6'8". That would be comparable to the height of the doors for the elevator at the Tacoma Metro site. However, the actual cab would be considerably taller than what the one is at the Metro station. The doors on this elevator that is proposed would be 42 inches wide. By comparison, the ones at the Tacoma Metro are 36 inches wide. Compared to the elevator here in the building, it's fairly comparable. The doors would actually be marginally less in height. However, the actual cab space, which is basically where everyone's standing, would actually be comparable and likely somewhat larger than what we have. So it's really just a matter of the door height more than anything else and the width of the doors being somewhat more narrow. The time frame on this is fairly lengthy. It takes about 12 to 14 weeks to fabricate elevator equipment. Obviously, there's some shop drawings and things that would have to be done as an initial step. And then once the cab is actually ready, it takes about 6 weeks to actually install it with all the associated electrical work. The proposal from TRG Construction is in the approximate amount of $190,000. Because of the time frame I just mentioned, most of the cost would actually be incurred in fiscal '07. This is currently not an item that is included in the budget. It would require a modification to the budget that you're in the process of discussing. There have been some pledges from some private parties towards the elevator. John Salmon, who many of you know is a Tacoma Park resident, who is an architect who primarily focuses on a lot of accessibility issues, had previously pledged $10,000 as a matching grant, and I believe Councilmember Williams did speak to him last week and confirmed that contribution. Based on discussions I've had with Howard Cohn, he indicated that either the Tacoma Foundation would be willing to pledge $10,000 as the match to Mr. Salmon's generous contribution, or there's also a private individual who would be willing to do so. So there's probably approximately $20,000 in private funding towards the elevator should the council wish to proceed. Certainly be happy to try to answer any questions that the council has. There is some timeliness to this issue because TRG Construction, as I mentioned earlier this evening, expects to have substantial completion for their contract later this month. This would be a change order to that contract, and basically you need to execute a change order while the contract is still in effect. So be happy to answer any questions the council may have.
I think it's wonderful that we have a time crunch because the contractor is moving so quickly. Mark?
I guess the most difficult part I have with this is not having competitive bids. I mean, and, not knowing, for example, what is an Otis elevator of the same dimension and specification cost. I mean, there aren't a lot of elevator companies.
Yes.
There are only like 3, I think.
Yeah, we had, as I mentioned, done some preliminary research as a staff in terms of what an elevator cab would cost. We contacted the company that actually does the service on our existing elevator, and I would mention that there was not an access panel at that time, so they weren't in there basically looking at the shaft itself. The ballpark figure they had given us, which I think I had mentioned to the council a number of months ago, was $130,000 for an elevator cab, so I think certainly what is priced is consistent with that. There is some additional work, electrical work and other things. In terms of some of the other costs that are noted, those have been reviewed by our construction management consultant and seem to be in line with what her experience would indicate as far as industry standards. I mean, once you get beyond the cab itself, most of it's going to be general conditions and overhead and profit.
Well, I guess one of the things that puzzled me was superintendent for $30,000 and labor for $8,000. That seemed odd.
An elevator cab, there's subs that are associated with this, and there is some oversight that would be required no matter who we retain. We can certainly go back to TRG Construction and see if there's any movement in any of those numbers, but putting in an elevator with given some of the associated trades, because it's not just one person, you're not just plopping a cab in, so you do need to have someone to oversee that.
It just seems like it's oddly disproportionate to have that much. 4 times the supervision as the cost of labor itself. If it winds up being normal, it winds up being normal. It just struck me as unusual.
It really has to do with the duration that someone would be on site. From start to finish, there is some design work that would be done by TRG in-house, because you actually have to do some shop drawings and things in terms of breaking through the wall and some of those type of things. As I mentioned, we can certainly go back to TRG and see if there's any movement in it. I would not anticipate there would be much, however, if any.
I appreciate the creative thinking that went into coming back with the proposal you have here for us, and I'm very supportive of the council approving this for action. I think the time is of the essence for us to give direction to the city manager, and I hope that council members will support this proposal. It seems reasonable to me, and certainly the accessibility issues to this building have been people's main concern, I would say, besides cost overruns. So here we are with an opportunity to address that for $189,000, and I hope that we'll take this opportunity.
I wonder if you could address the issue of working through TRG rather than going straight to an independent elevator company. If we go to TRG as your discussion outlines, we would be paying their overhead. But you think that this is a better way than independently dealing with an elevator contractor?
Well, quite honestly, you're not going to find an elevator company who's going to do architectural drawings and things like that. The council may recall that a number of months ago, we had a proposal from the project architect to do some architectural work that was in the range of $7,000 to $10,000, I believe. There does have to be someone who's going to coordinate some of the work that's not strictly related to an elevator company. I think if we approach someone else, we would basically need to be retaining someone to do that architectural work, prepare the shop drawings, coordinate all the permitting, and all those type of things. That expertise certainly does not exist among the staff. So I think, that's the benefit, I think, of, working with an existing contractor who I think to date has really demonstrated that they're up for the job and their performance record has been very good.
Any other council discussion, Bruce?
Just to note that I'm supportive of going ahead with this.
I'm supportive also, and my, as I'm looking at the members of the council, it appears that the other members of the council are also. I would agree that I think getting the elevator in here is one of the more important things that we have talked about as one of the things we want to do, and I would agree that we've got a wonderful building here. It's being well used. I think it would be more used if we could make the second and third floors accessible, more accessible to individuals who are not able to climb stairs, and so I would support it. All right, the final item on our agenda this evening is the first item on our budget, in our series of budget discussions. And perhaps before we get into that, I would like to let the council know sort of how the city manager and I have talked about handling the budget discussions. The city manager has suggested, and I think it's an excellent idea, that the council should focus most of its time on those areas where there's either new things happening or there has been some concerns expressed by the council. And so we've allocated the most time to the departments, the police, recreation, and housing. All the departments will come before the council, but the city manager has asked them to focus on new issues or, issues where there's been some concern. And for those departments where there has not been a great deal of new issues or there hasn't been concerns expressed by the council, we will try and move through those expeditiously. Council members are always free and encouraged to ask questions about anything for any of the departments. But we're going to try and focus our time on those three departments, police, recreation, and housing. And we're going to be dealing with one of those on Thursday. Public Works, of course, is a very large department also, but we haven't put it on as a large item because it's not one where there's a lot of new areas. They'll give us a review of what's going on, and then we'll move on to recreation, where I think there are a lot of issues that the council wants to discuss. Is there anything I forgot to mention?
No, I would just note before I forget that the agenda packet for Thursday evening's work session was left at your place at the dais. What we tried to do is identify some information that may be of interest to the council in regard to the three departmental budgets that will be discussed on Thursday evening. There have not been specific issues that have been brought to my attention by any member of the council. Working with the department heads, what is included in your packet for the library is basically some information about the Computer Learning Center that I thought might be of interest to the council, since that's obviously something that just went into operation this year. Public Works and Stormwater, we gave you some project listings to give you an idea of how the street restoration program has been proceeding, what work will be likely undertaken in FY07, and similarly we provided you with some of the same information for stormwater. Obviously the council had a fairly extensive discussion about the Stormwater Management Fund at the end of February, so there's probably not too much more that we can add to that, but at least wanted to give you the most up-to-date project listing that we have. In regard to recreation, there will be some other information forthcoming. The recreation director had given me a memo that is included in the packet, kind of highlighting some restructuring within her budget to kind of help you follow along. There's been some expenditures that have been reclassified, and we wanted to kind of call those out for you to make it a little bit easier as you try to do some comparisons. And as she has done in the past, she has also provided some revenue and expenditure data from a historical standpoint for recreation programs that might be of interest. I do anticipate that Thursday evening we had hoped to have it actually today, and it was not sent to her. We'll have some information regarding the new van that is contemplated to be purchased in the capital fund that obviously has a fairly hefty price tag of about $53,000. She has requested some information from the manufacturer that was supposed to be overnighted to us, so we would have received it today. Unfortunately, it did not arrive. So she will have that for you Thursday evening as well. in the intervening few days, if there is some information in particular relative to these departmental budgets or any other that you would like, please don't hesitate just to give me a call or email me. Obviously, we're trying to identify issues as soon as we can so we can turn around that information for you.
And if I could just add one more process issue. As we go through the budget, we will discuss each of the areas within the budget. And if there are items that council members wish to add to the budget or substantial changes that would decrease the budget, we will be keeping sort of a reconciliation list. And we'll note those things as we go through, add them to the reconciliation list, and then after we've gone through the entire budget, then we will look at the reconciliation list and decide what we want to do. Bruce?
Yeah, I just have one other kind of general question.
Okay.
I had the same reaction as the gentleman who spoke earlier in the public hearing about the budget in terms of the type of budget presentation that it is, that it's mostly just numbers and kind of not any of the going into what the various departments do or any of the changes in the measures of what they do. And I know in years past we had tended to get more and more of that information, and this one has none of that. And I was wondering if you could speak to why the information that's in the budget is there and why the information that isn't in the budget isn't there, in terms of how you approached it.
The format, obviously, as we talked about last year, I think unlike prior to my tenure, is designed to mirror the audit format. I think your specific question, though, as I understand it, has to do with performance measurements.
That type of thing, yes.
That, as I mentioned last year, that has been a goal. I'm not a fan of just counting things for the sake of counting them. I think you need to have data that you're actually tracking for a policy management type purpose. That is something that, we hope to get to. Quite frankly, so much of my time during my tenure here has been spent working on the community center that it's just not something I've had the opportunity to really work with the staff on.
One thing that we might be able to do, though, until we get to that point, is maybe just include some explanation of what is covered by the various departments, what kinds of programs they do, which I think would be useful. It's not a performance measurement by any sense, but it would give an individual who wasn't as familiar with all the things that the city did a sense of what, for example, we were spending our money in recreation on and that kind of thing.
For each of the departmental budgets, there is a narrative that talks about the various divisions,
Right.
what their primary function is. Certainly we're open to any suggestions the council may have beyond that to describe programmatically what each departmental budget is about.
Well, I think that it would be sort of an expanded form of that. Something, excuse me, something in between what's there and what Bruce is suggesting.
Yeah, it was just that my general reaction was that it was a pretty bare bones binder.
Certainly, as we indicated last year, certainly open to suggestions.
Okay.
The really major focus of this evening is to sort of go over an overview of the general fund budget, and specifically to talk a little bit about the fund balance. As the council talked about fairly extensively during the policy priorities session, there were a number of items that were identified through that process that basically had an impact on the general fund expenditures, and I can just touch briefly on those, so I think the council is well aware of them. As Councilmember Berry indicated earlier this evening, the proposed budget that is before you does contemplate the addition of a code enforcement officer. That is reflected in the Housing and Community Development Department. There are two other kind of more year-round positions, if you will, that are also included in the proposed budget. Those would be two part-time positions that are included in the police department budget. One that would basically focus on maintaining the department's accredited status, and there is a considerable amount of work associated with that process. The other part-time position would focus on evidence issues, which has been something the department has somewhat struggled to deal with in light of just staffing concerns. Some of the other items that were identified through the council priority session focused a lot on development-related issues. There is $100,000 included in the Housing and Community Development Department budget for specialized planning consulting services. That was really not necessarily limited to the New Hampshire Avenue corridor, but also dealing with other types of development issues that the city may be dealing with, including possible development at the Metro site, obviously the Washington Adventist Hospital relocation. It was actually been somewhat postponed from the time that this budget was developed. The document that I'm referring to, by the way, is the budget at a glance. This was a supplemental piece of information that you may not have placed in your binder that was distributed on April 17th. Those were some of the major items that basically impacted general fund expenditures and contributed in part to some of the increase that was alluded to earlier this evening. And then certainly, as any service business, the majority of our expenditures are related to personnel. And we are trying to maintain our competitiveness, particularly in the area of police, with other employers. Mr. Hobbs can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the market adjustment that is contemplated in this budget is 3.1%. And then obviously in keeping with the city's pay-for-performance philosophy, there is funding included in the budget for merit increases above and beyond that amount. Some of the other things that were probably of more note in terms of cost would deal with the take-home car policy that we have proposed for the council. This was an item I think that was before you last week. And if you look at the CIP, you will see a fairly sizable increase in terms of what is contemplated to be expended for police cars. It had been about $66,000, I think, historically, and I believe that number is now closer to 150-some thousand, if that's correct. What I would probably next just want to touch on that in a narrative form, if the council can look at your agenda packet, there is, wanted to just kind of walk through the general fund summary.
Can I just ask a quick question before we go there? On the budget at a glance, with the full-time equivalent chart, the one question I had that didn't seem to be covered in the narrative ahead of that was the increase by 1 FTE in the general government area.
Yes, I'd be happy to address that. As the council may recall, there is a employee in the city who has been primarily focused on community center matters. That is our project manager, Vanita George. At this juncture, pending any direction to the council to the contrary, we're assuming that the majority of the community center work will be wrapped up this fiscal year. That position, therefore, would no longer be charged to the community center fund and is reflected in the general government budget. Councilmember Williams.
Okay, so she would roll back into general government area.
That's correct.
Should I ask what she'd be doing?
Yes, I mean, one of the things in terms of general government operations, quite frankly, is there's been a number of still some committees that are proposed and just a lot of work, quite frankly, that generally have fallen on our community and government liaison shoulders. Some of that work, quite frankly, I think would be better directed to Ms. George. Ms. Ludlow has a number of projects that have probably been on her list almost since I started here almost 2 years ago, and I think it's just a matter of having a little bit more assistance to deal with some of those issues. Additionally, we have not been expending the time in-house in terms of risk management matters that we probably should be, given the effect that that would have on cities' insurance rates. We have also had some discussion internally within our department of having Ms. George provide some of the oversight that was recommended by the Emergency Management Committee in lieu of basically adding a position to have her provide some of that focus and support to Mr. Hobbs. Did I adequately respond to your question, Councilmember Williams?
That's very helpful, just that it wasn't in the narrative. Yes.
Okay. If the council can kind of flip through your agenda packet, and the actual materials for this item are actually tied to the public hearing item, so it would be at the front of your agenda packet. Since the focus tonight is on the general fund, if you could flip to the page that basically is the budget summary for the general fund, and I think this provides a fairly good snapshot in terms of what the bottom line is for general fund revenues as well as expenditures. As I noted in the agenda cover sheet and as we talked about, I believe it was last week, since this budget was given to the council almost a month ago, we have received the actual rates for our employee health insurance. Those ended up being higher than what we had projected at the time the budget was put together. We had assumed, based on the information we had received, that increase would be approximately 10%. In actuality, that rate of increase is 15.9%. That was somewhat offset by lower than anticipated dental insurance rates, but to kind of cut to the chase, the impact on general fund expenditures is in the range of $60,000. As I had mentioned last week, rather than going through and updating each and every sheet, which could be very time-consuming only to have the council make other changes as the budget process moved along, what I did was basically update this summary sheet. So the expenditures that are reflected on this page basically may differ somewhat than what was in your budget binder, mainly only because of the health insurance. That has been the only change. General fund revenues are projected at $16.5 million. Total expenditures are budgeted or proposed to be budgeted at $17.5. Basically, as Mr. Theory did note, that leaves an excess or a shortfall of, if you will, of about $1 million. I would note that part of that basically reflects monies that are being taken from the applicable reserve. That would include street loan proceeds and the equipment replacement reserve, which are money specifically set aside for those purposes over the years. So some of that can look slightly distorted, but that is the appropriate way for budgeting. The revenues are actually in a special reserve fund, and the expenditures basically are booked as an expenditure in the year that they are incurred.
Mr. Terry referred to it as a deficit. We do not have a deficit. We have funding to cover those expenditures.
Correct.
Is
It
that
is
correct?
coming from the general fund balance, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly.
Would it be helpful to provide a footnote that kind of makes that tie a little bit more obvious?
We can certainly do that, Councilmember Williams. You'd like to?
Then we could avoid that confusion.
Well, it's pretty clear on the tables.
I'm just thinking.
And it's in the budget transmittal message. We can certainly try to note that in a number of different ways, depending on how people respond to information in different ways. Some prefer it narratively, some prefer it to be in a chart or something like that.
I'm just thinking if there's a way to broaden the applicability of that.
Sure.
So that people catch it in the different ways that they read.
Sure, we would be happy to look at that. So that's basically what the $998,792 number references. If you keep going down the page, you'll see that there is an operating transfer out. It's in parentheses. It's roughly $150,000. That basically is comprised of two different figures. In the special revenue funds, certain programs, particularly the program Open Space, and certain police grants do require a match of city funds against the grant amount. The majority of this amount, however, represents the anticipated expenditure of program Open Space funds, possibly for the gym, and there is a 25% match that is required by the program. As I indicated in response to Mr. Theory's question, if the council, for whatever reason, chooses not to go forward, that operating transfer would not be necessary. We had some discussion last week about the various funding sources that could be used for the community center fund. That's obviously not what we're here to talk about this evening, but depending on which source the council chooses to use for the feasibility study, some require a match, some do not. So I think that's something that as we move forward with the discussion of the community center fund budget, we'll need to have some further discussion about that. But that is what that operating transfer number represents, is primarily a general fund match to the program Open Space funds for the gym project. As you go down the page, basically, you'll see the bottom line fund balance number that is projected for June 30th of 2007, and that is roughly $3.1 million. There is always a lot of interest, and there has been it was last year, in terms of what exactly comprises that $3.1 million number. And if the council doesn't have any just general questions, I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about the fund balance so there's a clear understanding of how that is put together and what that number actually means in terms of the council's decision-making regarding the budget. Councilmember Clay?
I have a question before we go on to the fund balance back to the.
You need to use your mic.
I have a question before we go on to the fund balance, back on page 5 of the transmittal letter. The positions that are being added to the police department budget, are those rebatable positions?
No, they would not be. Are there any other questions before we move on?
Does the county have an accreditation officer or office?
We would have to check. I honestly don't know. Under the current formula, there is, Ms. Ludlow can correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no provision in the current rebate formula, I believe, for a rebate for an accreditation officer. She's certainly much more familiar with that formula than I am, however.
Right, under the current formula, that's not included. Should be noted that coming to you will be discussion of a process going forward on tax duplication, and one of the major issues is to have council member encouragement of renegotiation of the police rebate with the new county executive staff.
If there's no other questions just generally about the budget, wanted to call the council's attention to a handout from this evening. It's entitled General Fund Fund Balance Projection. Does everyone have that? Okay. I think some of the council members are already aware of this, but perhaps for the benefit of the public, we refer to the general fund balance kind of as if it's one number, but it actually has a number of component parts. In some instances, a portion of the fund balance is reserved. That is basically a policy decision of this council and set forth in the charter. The reserve portion of the fund balance is essentially 3 different parts. It is going to be the equipment replacement reserve, which is the money that the city sets aside for the future replacement of the city's vehicle fleet and other equipment. There is the emergency reserve, which is actually mandated by the charter. It's set up an amount of $250,000 a number of years ago. Over time, that number has grown due to interest accrual being applied to that. The last portion, which is reserved, is the street loan proceeds. In July of 2005, the city took out or borrowed approximately $2 million to basically expedite some of our street improvements. Those monies are restricted and can only be used for street improvements. So that is essentially set aside and basically tracked separately.
I believe the charter also references the unappropriated reserve, which is, my recollection is 2-point-something% of the total revenues or budget. I can't remember which it is, which is separate from either the emergency or the equipment replacement reserve.
Technically, you're correct, Mayor Porter. Technically, in accordance with the audit, that is actually shown as an unreserved portion of the fund balance. That is how it's reflected in the charter because its purpose is not specific, and the council can choose to take some of that undesignated amount, apply it to the succeeding year's budget. So the terminology that is being used here is consistent with what's in the audit, so if someone's trying to track that, they're able to do so.
I think it would be helpful, though, just to show that amount. I mean, by my calculation, it's in here. It's covered. But I think just maybe to show it either, if you prefer to show it in the unreserved fund balance or the reserved fund balance, but just to show it, just to reassure anyone who might be concerned, because it says that we're supposed to set aside X amount in our budget not to be appropriated at the time of the budget. You're correct, it can be appropriated later, but if we could just show it to reassure anyone that it is in fact in there.
Yes, it is actually, if you read the section on the non-departmental section of the budget, it is actually specifically called out both in the narrative as well as in the spreadsheet data for the non-departmental.
Right,
and
but I mean, in terms of when you're doing your fund balance projection, I think it would be helpful there.
Yeah, actually, if you can wait a minute, there's actually a calculation sheet that was included in the agenda packet. If you want to go ahead and flip to that, it was included with the public hearing number. There's actually a spreadsheet that is referred to as general fund balance projection. And this is essentially the spreadsheet that I used for my own tracking purposes in terms of.
Are you talking about the last page?
That is correct. It is the last page. What this basically shows you is, and if someone were to go back to the audit for July 1st or June 30th of 2005, the amount that is shown for the street loan proceeds, the emergency reserve, the equipment replacement reserve, and the unreserved basically will match what is in the audit. Additions are basically going to be, and for simplicity purposes, interest earnings are booked during the time of the audit and reconciled. The only thing that would necessarily cause an addition would be either a contribution to the equipment replacement reserve, or basically any excess of revenues over expenditures that would occur would go to the unreserved. So that's what you're going to see in the addition column. That's how a balance would increase. The deletions are typically going to be expenditures. So if you look at the street loan proceeds, what that figure indicates is how much of the street loan monies are anticipated to be expended during the fiscal year. So for instance, for the fiscal year that we're currently in, FY06, the Public Works Director believes that the department will expend approximately $866,000 in street loan proceeds in this fiscal year. Similarly, in FY07, she's anticipating that we'll expend about $91,000. In terms of the emergency reserve, you'll notice there's really no additions and no deletions. As I mentioned, there would be some interest earnings that Ms. Brooks, in conjunction with the auditors, will be calculating, but other than interest earnings, that amount is relatively static. There's no new contributions that are being made by the city. The equipment replacement reserve, as I mentioned just a moment ago, additions are going to basically be contributions that this council chooses to make to the equipment replacement reserve. For budgetary purposes, that is shown as an expenditure in the non-departmental fund. In actuality, it's not actually an expenditure. What you're doing is, Ms. Brooks and her staff will be doing this, you're moving money from one pot, if you will, in the fund balance to another. So it's moving from unreserved to reserved. And that's basically the additions that you'll see for the equipment replacement reserve. In the FY06 budget, the council had approved allocating $100,000 to the equipment replacement reserve. The budget that is before you basically contemplates an increase in that amount to $300,000. The unreserved amounts basically, as I mentioned, are going to increase or decrease depending on what is happening with revenues and expenditures. Basically, for instance, for this year, you'll note that the unreserved portion of the fund balance is projected to go up by about $613,000. The $100,000 deletion, once again, is a movement or a contribution to the equipment replacement reserve. When you go to FY07, you'll see a deletion of about $1 million. Basically, that is a function of both revenues, expenditures exceeding revenues, as well as the contribution to the equipment replacement reserve. I know that's a lot of numbers. It may sound a little bit like gobbledygook, but I know there's a lot of interest in what exactly is happening with those numbers. In response to the mayor's question, the 2.5% that she alluded to is actually included as an expenditure. So basically, we budget that amount as an expenditure in the non-departmental. It is set aside specifically in an account. Unless the council chooses to appropriate those funds at some point during the fiscal year, they essentially fall back to the fund balance.
Okay, I understand what you're saying.
Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
I understand. Yeah, I had thought that they would show up in more than one place, but I see what you're saying.
Okay. Like I said, I wanted to kind of walk through the numbers mainly because there were some questions about that. If you flip back to sort of the narrative sheet that was passed out this evening, I'm just trying to put the budget in context as you begin your deliberations. And because of the separate reserve fund, sometimes looking at the summary sheet doesn't exactly kind of show the whole picture of what's happening, or it makes it a little bit difficult to discern. We just sort of walk through the components that make up the general fund balance. If you look at the summary sheet that's included in the agenda packet, you'll basically see the general fund revenues, which is the $16.5 million. What is budgeted as a revenue is basically things that what I would refer to as true operating revenues. So it's going to basically be money that is either accrued during the fiscal year. In other words, if you bill something but it doesn't come in for some reason until right after the end of the fiscal year, from an accounting standpoint, it's still shown as a revenue in this year. You see a lot of that with, for instance, stormwater billings where perhaps someone pays late. It actually will show in the fiscal year in which it was due, not when it was paid. Property taxes are handled in a similar manner. Simple things such as when we do inspections or recreation programs. So as I mentioned, we're going to be spending some funds in FY07, for instance, coming out of the street loan proceeds or coming out of the equipment replacement reserve. Those funds are not shown as revenues because they're really not operating revenues. You're just sort of moving money around, if you will, within the fund balance. So sometimes, as I mentioned before, that's why what may appear to be a larger shortfall, if you will, it can be somewhat misleading because you're pulling money from funds that have been specifically set aside for that purpose. So basically, when you're pulling money from the street loan proceeds or from the equipment replacement reserve, as we just walked through that spreadsheet, what you're going to actually see is that portion of the fund balance going down, which is, with the street loan proceeds, is obviously what you want to have happen. You borrowed it for street improvements, and the goal is to try to get those funds expended as soon as feasible and to get the streets in good repair. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Kind of moving on to the expenditures, and some of this we probably have touched on. What you're going to see on the summary sheet is basically the cost of operating the various city departments. There's going to be certain non-departmental expenditures that are things like insurance, debt service. As I mentioned a little while ago, there is a contribution that is contemplated of $300,000 to the equipment replacement reserve that shows up in the non-departmental expenditures. It's actually just budgeted as an expenditure so that it's disclosed to the community. They know what we're contemplating. In reality, it's just going to move from one reserve account or one fund balance account to another. And that is footnoted. If someone looks historically at what they'll see, they'll kind of see a 0, 0, 0, because that's not how it's handled from an audit standpoint. But it is a fairly sizable sum of money, and so we're trying to make that clear to anyone looking at the budget how it is handled. As I indicated in response to the mayor's question, the 2.5% of expenditures that are essentially contingency accounts, if you will, are budgeted in non-departmental. So this budget, when you try to track through and figure out where your fund balance is going to be, it's going to assume or give the appearance that those funds are fully expended. That's ultimately up to the council whether those funds are expended. You make those decisions. If you choose to pull anything from those contingency accounts, those are always approved by ordinance and clearly disclosed to the public what you are doing. So to some extent, since this would appear when you track down through the summary sheet that those contingency accounts are fully expended, if the council chooses not to do that or does not authorize that, your ending fund balance would actually be higher than what this would show. But I can't really contemplate what you're going to do over the course of the year, so this is always the way it's handled from a budgeting standpoint.
And it's probably worth noting that in every year I remember that we've passed a budget, we have ended up expending fewer funds than were budgeted.
Correct. And that's certainly been the case during my tenure here. In the capital outlay number for FY07, that's kind of a mixture of items. There are some capital outlay items that are actually being paid for out of general fund monies, if you will, meaning FY07 operating revenues, and there is a portion of those expenditures that are actually being paid for through the equipment replacement reserve as contemplated in the CIP or from the street loan proceeds. The actual amount of those items, and I'll just round it off, is approximately $392,000. So when you look at that capital outlay figure of just over $1 million, keep in mind that roughly $400,000 of that is being paid for out of dedicated funds that you have specifically set aside for those purposes. Okay? If you can kind of flip to the second page, part of the reason I did this as a handout, so after we're done, you can kind of refer back to it and if you have other questions. But I think keeping in mind what the fund balance is and how it's utilized and kind of what cash is coming in and coming out, I think is really critical to how the council moves forward in your budget deliberations and the decisions that you make. As I mentioned, the operating revenues that the budget assumes are roughly $16.5 million, and that's going to basically be cash that is coming in or contemplated to come in FY07. As I just mentioned, when you look at the total expenditures, there are some of those that are being paid for out of these dedicated reserve funds, approximately $400,000 of that. So as I tried to think of how to kind of communicate this to the council or explain it to you, what I thought might be helpful is to sort of look at this almost from a net operating income standpoint, if you will. What cash do you have coming in on that annual basis, and what cash do you have going out? You know, and kind of take aside these reserve funds that kind of make this a little bit more complicated. If you back out the money that is coming out of the equipment replacement reserve, as well as the street loan proceeds, which, as I mentioned, is about $400,000, what you end up with is, rather than, if you go down the sheet where you see kind of a negative $1.1 million, is you actually have, probably wrong terminology, but an operating loss of about $606,000. What that means is you're pulling $606,000 from your unallocated or unreserved fund balance. This budget contemplates that the fund balance would go down by that amount. That is before we make any operating transfers to the other funds. And that's the $150,000 we talked about that would be a match to the program open space funds should the council choose to proceed, you know, with the gym project. When you add in that operating transfer, overall what that means is that the unreserved portion of the general fund balance would go down by roughly $756,000. I know that's a lot of numbers, but basically that's kind of what it translates into. If you look at the spreadsheet that was included in the agenda packet, which is the last page, it's going to show that we would project it to end FY07, if the council accepts this budget as presented, with an unreserved fund balance of about $1.8 million. Once again, that may be somewhat understated, because if you don't spend the contingency accounts, that would basically be added to that amount. I think when people hear that you're doing, you know, if you want to use, I believe Mr. Theory's term, deficit budgeting, that can make people kind of nervous. I guess the one thing I wanted to stress to the council is that the financial position of the city, if this budget is accepted, would remain very strong. You know, certainly I would not be recommending a budget to you that I thought would do otherwise, and that's my responsibility to tell you that. In addition to the unreserved portion of the fund balance, which is, as I mentioned, right now projected at $1.8 million, assuming the contingency accounts are fully expended, which, as the mayor noted, has never historically happened here. The emergency reserve is also something that, while it's restricted, it is funding that is available to the city should there be some sort of emergency situation. Many cities don't choose to break it up like this. When I look at the unreserved portion of the fund balance, or what is available to the city to help get us through any kind of timing issues in terms of cash flow or what you have available in the case of an emergency, in my mind it's almost better to look at those two numbers together. While one of them is set aside and reserved by charter, the whole idea of a fund balance is to get you through timing issues in cash and to have cash available should you have some sort of emergency situation that you don't contemplate. And so basically, I mean, the city would end the year with basically a very strong fund balance. The reason I wanted to go through the analysis or the parallel to a net operating income is that basically your fund balance does tend to build up over the years, sometimes due to unusual circumstances that don't tend to repeat themselves. For instance, last year we got a check, and Ms. Brooks can correct me if I'm wrong, that came in after the end of the fiscal year for income tax that no one anticipated. It was approximately $200,000. Due to unique circumstances, sometimes due to staffing shortages in a particular department, you may have savings that result because of that. Those events, though, can be one-time events, and so when you have a fund balance that builds up over time, sometimes it's preferable to use that accrued fund balance for one-time capital expenditures or things that are non-recurring. If you start getting into increasing an ongoing obligation or a program, you do have to think about what happens if that one-time event doesn't repeat itself, and how are you going to pay for new programs. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to go through this analysis. Staff and I were trying to think of some parallels, and I guess, let's say you went out and you bet on the Kentucky Derby and you got a windfall. That's going to be nice cash to have in your pocket, but you're probably not going to go out and buy a really expensive home with a very high mortgage payment that you don't have income to support over time. And it's sort of the same parallel, if you will. So I guess my ending message is that I think the financial position of the city is strong. It will continue to be strong. I think as the council goes through its deliberations, and certainly there's a lot of concern that was expressed here this evening about the tax rate, one of the things you need to think of is how far down do you want to take your fund balance and for what purpose? If the council were to increase your overall operating expenditures, that has an ongoing effect into future fiscal years, you do have to give some thought exactly of how you would pay for that. Unfortunately, in Maryland, compared to the state that I worked in previously as a local jurisdiction, you don't have a lot of avenues to raise funding. And so it does put a lot of pressure on the city in terms of the community as well as the property tax. We just don't have that many avenues to generate revenue as a municipality in Maryland. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind as you begin your budget deliberations and as you talk about what you want to leave in this budget and what you might want to take out. So it's a lot of numbers. I know it's throwing a lot of things at you. I hope I haven't confused you too much, but I did think it was important to sort of go through the budget in more of a global perspective before you start your individual deliberations with the department heads.
Are there any overall questions on the budget?
I'm not sure these are overall questions, but I do have a couple that I want to bring to your attention. One is the Safe Tacoma proposal. It looks like from your April 10th document that you didn't anticipate a partner coming forward in time for this budget, but it does look like DC will be allocating money for that. Do you have any ideas about where $75,000 would be best coming from?
Can I suggest, I'm supportive of that also, but let me suggest it just in terms of process, that items that are not on the document that we've got in here, that we put on the reconciliation list, and then we give enough time to add. I know that there are other things that are going to come up too that members of the council may support. But in terms of process, if we go through what's here first, so we're comfortable with what has been proposed in the city manager's budget, and then after we've familiarized ourselves with that, then we go and recraft it into the council's budget by adding or subtracting such items as the council might want to add or subtract, and that would be one of the things. You put that on the list, and I'm assuming it's going in starting on the reconciliation list. I've had other people make suggestions to me about things that they would like to have us see in the budget, and what I'm telling people is I think the way to deal with that would be after we've gone through the entire budget to then start dealing with those items, some of which I think are important.
Given that before the budget came out, I requested that this be included in the budget, and it was not. I'm bringing it to your attention now because it is, in my view, an oversight. I would like to stress that if DC is coming forward with funding and the City of Tacoma Park does not, we won't see the Safe Tacoma program put in place. And I'm assuming that I'm reading your memo right, which is your transmittal document, which does say that $100,000 is earmarked for the C-Safe continuation. Is that right?
No, let me clarify. Obviously, in terms of moving forward with the budget, much of this document reflects the priorities that were established by the council during its deliberations in both January and March. And those specific items for which staff received direction, for instance, where there was consensus in terms of the code enforcement officer, are reflected in this document. There were two specific issues related to, and I'll just use the term C-Safe, though I know we're also talking about Safe Tacoma. There were conflicting comments, Councilmember Austin Lane, made by various council members in terms of, not that I think that there was not general support, but in terms of the timing, in terms of when funds should be budgeted. There was no specific direction given by a majority of the council as part of the policy setting discussions earlier this year. Councilmember Berry also had expressed a desire to ensure that there was some continued funding or a guarantee by the council, if you will, for the Tacoma-Langley Sea Safe, as I understood his comment, and once again, there was not general discussion by the council as a whole or direction given, is that he was not asking for funding specifically to be set aside, though I may have misunderstood his intent. It was a matter that if we would essentially make a pledge to those employees who are under contract to the city, that their employment would in essence be guaranteed for a period of 6 months, so that we didn't continue this endless cycle of people being concerned that grant funding may not come through. They start looking for jobs in January and February, and by the time the grant funding is secured, they've already moved on to other jobs. So I recognize that there were those issues that were discussed by the council. However, there was no specific direction given, and that's why it's not reflected in the budget. My assumption would be that there would be further discussion and deliberation by the council and direction given by the conclusion of this process, so the budget could be modified accordingly.
Mayor Porter, are you saying that this is just going to be one of many items on the reconciliation?
My guess is that there will be a number of items on the reconciliation list. I don't think that that says anything about what the council's interest would be in individual items.
Would it make sense to discuss this separately as an agenda item instead of waiting until we get to reconciliation, given that no clear direction was given from this council by a majority of members?
I think that there is a process already set up to deal with items that members of the council, including myself and you, would like to add to the budget, and that is the reconciliation process. I don't think that putting something on the reconciliation list is an indication that the council is not interested in doing it.
Well,
but it's just a question of the
what
council.
I remember was Councilmember Siemens and I thought tentatively Councilmember Berry and you and me were the four that lined up behind the Safe Tacoma proposal. I can see that Mark does not support it.
Well, no.
That's not true.
I think
so everyone did?
No.
No, we said the discussion was we needed to see where the other money was coming from. I didn't hear anybody object to the Safe Tacoma proposal. The only question was whether we should put it in the budget if we didn't know where money was coming from.
Yeah.
That was the issue.
Yeah.
Okay, and if the money comes from the DC budget, but Tacoma Park doesn't have it in our budget,
Joy,
we pass our budget before they pass theirs.
Right.
It's already come out of committee.
Right.
We do the reconciliation before that, too.
Right. And the council's budget, this is not the council's budget. This is not the city budget. This is the city manager's proposed budget to the council. I don't know, because we haven't had that discussion yet, whether the Safe Tacoma money, the additional $75,000, will be in the final budget or not. The fact that it's not in here says nothing about whether it's in the final budget or not. The council will look at that. Will look at that program in the context of everything else that we have learned about what was in the city manager's budget and make that decision.
What I was clarifying from the city manager was that it was neither the $100,000 nor the $75,000.
That is correct, Councilmember Austin Lane.
Okay, well, I misread that.
To be very clear, my support for Safe Tacoma was conditioned on that it not come at the expense of the C-Safe program, and I will need clarification and further discussion on the extent to which this becomes a permanent part of the city budget, where we're entirely dependent on grant funding for C-Safe, which in my belief would not be fair.
And I think that the very brief discussion we've had here, I think, illustrates why we need to have a larger discussion in the context of the entire budget to make decisions like that. I think it's a good program. I'm supportive of it. And I don't think the fact that it's on the reconciliation list, it tells you anything about whether the council will support it or not. I think it's a question of what other things we have looked at it up to that point, and, you know, the case that the people who support it can make at that time.
My next item is a question about the commercial inspector. This came up on the New Hampshire Avenue tour, and I would like the city manager to explore contracting with the county for that position. I think we could have some savings in terms of training and supervision and a variety of other things that, given that our department is basically one inspector right now, and we would be doubling that by hiring a second one. So I'd like to see about the MOU, how that would be structured with the county. Let's see.
Councilmember Austin Lane, I just want to make a point of clarification. When you're saying commercial inspection, typically that terminology would refer to inspections of businesses. The property maintenance code, which is more the residential. I just want to make sure I understand what you're interested in exploring so we can bring the information back to you. There's really two different types of inspections.
Right, and it was what we talked about on Friday.
Okay.
Friday?
In the tour?
Yeah,
Right.
on the
Okay.
tour.
Okay. Just
With
wanted to make
Elizabeth
sure I was
Davidson.
clear. Thank you.
So I believe she would be the right point of contact for that. The other thing is the gardening and recreation staff. Those are the areas of the budget I actually may not be here for all of the budget work sessions. So I want to make sure that I say this at the outset, that I think those are that's where we really need additional staff. We now have a large community center to program, and we've already seen the limitations of our ability to handle opening Hefner and investigating a skate park. And I would like to make sure that we are following through on our commitment to the community center, as well as having the ability to manage these issues as they come up throughout the year. With the gardening staff, I'm aware of a very small staff that assists Mike Walsh, and I want to make sure that with all of the new streetscaping we're putting in, that there is sufficient money budgeted to make sure that we maintain it properly. I've been getting complaints from Carroll Avenue folks that we're falling short on that in this budget year. So I'd like to make sure that in next budget year we are on top of that. Two other things. One is that we've talked a couple of times this year about council receiving training or attending conferences besides MML, and I'm hopeful that the budget can be more flexible in that respect. I think that MML is an important conference, but I'd like to see the specification that the money budgeted for MML has to be spent for MML. And I'm not sure if there was a resolution passed to that effect or some previous council addressed this in public session, but I would like to see documentation of that.
Sure.
And the last thing is for two different projects. The Safe Tacoma project could have an opportunity for funding through a grant source, but it would require a grant writer. And the Business Association is a cross-jurisdictional entity and has expressed interest in seeking this grant funding. However, they don't have a grant writer, and I don't believe that the city has one on staff. So this is an opportunity that we will probably miss unless we can find someone to help us with this project now. Additionally, there are a variety of projects that have been stalled, even though they have strong community support because of the lack of a grant writer. The two that come to mind are the film festival, and additional monies could be sought from the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County. I believe they have a deadline coming up in June, and that would help put that film festival on more sustainable footing instead of relying on the council's support. The other opportunity is to improve our neighborhood is at the border with D.C. on Maple Avenue. The boundary stone has been talked about for years, if not decades. And it's a site that has historical significance and very, very rich meaning in our community, given that we are a cross-jurisdictional community over 100 years old. And I would like to see that project funded. And I think that there are grants to do that. But without someone who can investigate these things and actually make the application, we will continue to miss out on those opportunities. So I'd appreciate some kind of contract information about a grant writer.
Bruce?
Yeah, one clarification and one question. A couple of times this evening, the code enforcement topic has come up, and I just wanted to remind folks again that it was a number of years ago now when the code enforcement efforts were more proactive in terms of what's now complaint-based. Then they were more proactive, then they became a little less proactive when there were a number of difficulties associated with that, and the council directed staff to make it complaint-based.
Back off.
Given the number of residents who came in response to the enforcement that had more teeth, where the staff went out and noted things and cited folks, and we had a room full of angry residents who had been cited for peeling paint or whatever the particular infractions were, and it was very obvious at that point in time that the council didn't want to go to those lengths with the code enforcement process. So that's one reason why the type of enforcement that we have now is what it is. And I just wanted to remind folks of that. I don't know if that's me.
I think it's just humming.
General, it's me? I can hum with the best of them, but that's not my hum. And the question I have for the city manager is on the
I moved it the other way to try to stop it.
It's gone.
Okay, go ahead.
On the, no, it's back. Just stand there.
The human antenna.
On the in the budget document, in the general fund where it has revenues by source, and it has the figures, the history of figures for the personal property tax revenues. The proposed amount is about the same as in FY03. It went up considerably in FY04 and 5, and then there was a fallback in the current fiscal year, and estimated is less than was budgeted. And I'm a little puzzled by that, in that I know what that personal property tax is. It's business personal property tax. And I know I have this question most years. And the fact that we had some difficulties in the past collecting that, and I'm wondering whether the declining amount that we see in the proposed budget reflects collection history that we think is accurate and valid, whether there are continuing difficulties with collections. Just if you can make any comments about that.
I have probably two comments, Councilmember Williams. One is we get the data on which the revenue projection is based comes from the state. Ms. Brooks was in contact with one of the state agencies. So basically, part of this is information obtained by them. I would also note that the personal property tax rate is a factor, if you will, of the rate assessed by the council on real properties, 2.5 times. The council did reduce the rate, if you will recall, for FY06. So part of it's a function of rate, and obviously I don't know that we can speak to what the base is, but that's information that is given by the state, since they're the ones who maintain it.
Yeah, I just know that in the past, the former treasurer noted some difficulties in how there were difficulties in identifying who should be paying it and how the database was worked with the state and I believe also with the county, because some of that tied into. I know the information comes from the state. I can't remember the specifics, but I know there were difficulties that seemed to be not easily solved.
Yeah, we could certainly look into it further. I'm sure Ms. Brooks would be happy to give Ms. McKenzie a call and just pick her brain for institutional knowledge.
Yeah,
that's not an issue that has kind of come to my attention, or I believe hers.
It just seems odd that it would have been 33% higher 2 years ago than is proposed for this coming year. And I guess the only thing I can imagine that would make it different would be that there are either a lesser number of businesses in the city, or the businesses in the city, the same businesses in the city have less personal property on which to collect tax, the mix of businesses, that kind of thing. Otherwise, it doesn't seem like it should be going down.
As I mentioned, what we could do, if you'd like, is obviously part of it's the tax rate, but also just see if we can get some information in terms of what's happened with the base and see if that will shed some light on it. And like I mentioned, we'd certainly be happy to talk to Ms. McKenzie and get some institutional knowledge, since you've indicated this is an issue she's familiar with.
Right. So it's a good place to find some extra money.
I'd like to thank Bruce for his historical reminder about the history of code enforcement in the city, but I would also like to as a rejoinder, suggest that we ain't talking about peeling paint here. We're talking about a large percentage of the housing stock in certain areas of the city that are going downhill in a very fast and upsetting fashion. And I don't know if it's adding a full-time enforcement officer or contracting, or maybe there's some more creative ways of doing it than that, but it does appear that it's deteriorating faster than the one officer that we presently have on the street can control. So just as a cautionary measure that it may have been different 8 years ago or 4 years ago, but things I think have changed a lot in that period of time.
And I also think that it's true that what you're referring to is not really a change in enforcement. It was a change in what kinds of things we went out and identified as being worthy of enforcement. It's not like we stopped enforcing things. It's just that we stopped going out and proactively identifying things. And I would agree with Councilmember Berry that the kinds of things that created the problem some years back were very minor. I think the reason that the council felt comfortable in letting them go, unless there was a complaint, is because they were sufficiently minor that the neighbors had not even complained or known about them or objected to them. It was our sending staff street by street to go and look for peeling paint and look for grass, whatever they were, grass too high or whatever it was that they were. It wasn't these kinds of things that Councilmember Berry has identified, where there are serious issues that are leading to the deterioration of neighborhoods.
Can I just ask as a starting point whether code enforcement could give us kind of a brief report on what's the current inspector doing, what kinds of units are they inspecting and how many inspections are they performing? Because it might be that we ask them to take a break from some of the stuff they're doing and focus on the issues in the ward right now, and just go down and inspect the houses, issue the citations, and then resume a more normal thing. So I think maybe knowing what they're up to.
Sure. You'll be reviewing the Housing and Community Development Department budget next Monday. I have a preparation meeting with Ms. Daines tomorrow, and I will mention that to her.
Okay.
Are there any other?
If I can just kind of. Yes. I would say that I hear you in terms of what was observed, And I think that needs to be addressed. I would say that it runs counter to my general observation. In my ward, my sense is that a number of the properties that have been in less than stellar shape have generally been improved, and I know there are still some that are problems, but that overall, my sense is that the properties are looking better and are having the kinds of investment that make that happen because of the general real estate market.
Right. I don't think this is a citywide phenomenon. I think that it's situational, and if we were to focus our efforts on those places where clearly there's a problem, then I think we'll be better off overall.
Good.
I think this has been a useful discussion, and I would encourage council members to, as early in the process as they can, to identify anything that they would like to put on the reconciliation list or anything they would like further information about, to give the staff as much advance notice as possible, so we can get as much information as they're able to put together without sort of having them scrambling at the last minute. So I'm sure it would be appropriate in any of our further discussions, if you come up with an idea, to send it to the city manager or to bring it up in another discussion and to get it out sooner rather than later, please.
One other quick question. In that same revenues and general fund, one thing I'm trying to remember is the item that you brought to our attention some months back about the WA administration fee, and I see it's zeroed out in both the current year and the proposed budget. And what I'm trying to remember is whether you had come up with some other proposal that you were contemplating tied to that or not.
The administration fee.
I know that was tied to the bond.
It was tied to a bond, and
Right.
what actually ended up happening is, based on data we had gotten during last year's budget process, they anticipated that the bonds would still be outstanding this year. They actually refunded them more quickly than they had originally anticipated. We have requested a copy of their audited financial statement so we can verify that it was, paid off, just to make sure. But for many large nonprofit institutions, though that does not appear to be the practice in this area, because we had done some research, you may ask for a payment in lieu of taxes for tax-exempt entities to kind of represent or to compensate the city in some manner for the service demands created by those institutions, for which you're not getting property taxes. This was an issue Ms. Ludlow and I had talked about some time ago, and she actually, at my request, contacted some of the jurisdictions that do have hospitals, for instance, within their borders. It apparently is not the practice. We have not found anybody. That does not mean that we couldn't ask, but obviously, whether you wish to go through this, given that Washington Adventists may plan to relocate, it's certainly a discussion we could have. The city really has no mechanism to impose a pilot on anyone. It's really something that you work out through a matter of negotiation. That is a fairly common practice in other parts of the country. It does not appear to be that common in this area for whatever reason.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find places to increase revenue.
Any additional comments or questions? If not, we're adjourned.